Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The CB radio crackled with static as Caleb Hensley guided his 18-wheeler through the darkening Kansas plains. Storm warnings had been coming through all afternoon, but dispatch didn't care about weather unless the roads were officially closed. The load of agricultural equipment he was hauling from Topeka to Denver couldn't wait, they said. Deadlines didn't bend for acts of God. Caleb had been driving these routes for 12 years, long enough to know when the sky was about to turn mean. The clouds overhead weren't just dark. They had that greenish tinge that made experienced plains drivers grip their steering wheels a little tighter. It was late April, peak tornado season, and the air felt wrong in that specific way it does before all hell breaks loose. Heavy and electric, like breathing through wet cotton. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour, and the wind was picking up, pushing his trailer sideways with each gust. He'd seen plenty of storms roll through Kansas, watched them from truck stop windows while other drivers swapped stories about near misses and twisted metal. But this one felt different. The Weather Service had upgraded from watch to warning 30 minutes ago, and now they were telling everyone to seek immediate shelter. Caleb checked his mirrors again, a habit so ingrained he did it without thinking. Nothing behind him but empty highway and angry sky. The last vehicle he'd passed was a pickup truck 20 miles back, and that driver had been smart enough to pull off at the last exit. But Caleb couldn't afford another late delivery. His company had already written him up twice this year for weather delays. One more and they'd put him on probation, maybe worse. The mortgage on his house in Salina didn't pay itself, and his ex-wife's lawyer didn't accept excuses when the alimony check was late. The first fat raindrops hit his windshield like bullets. Within seconds, it was a deluge. His wipers, even on their fastest setting, couldn't keep up. The road ahead disappeared into a gray wall of water. He eased off the accelerator, letting his speed drop to 40, then 30. The trailer swayed behind him, fighting against the crosswind. Lightning split the sky to his left, so close he could feel the electricity in the air, making the hair on his arms stand up under his flannel shirt. That's when he saw it through the rain. A building off to the right, maybe a quarter mile up. Red neon flickered through the downpour. A diner, one of those old railroad car types that used to dot every highway in America before the interstate system killed them off. He didn't remember seeing it on this stretch before, but visibility was so bad he could barely see 50 feet ahead. The parking lot looked empty except for what might have been an old pickup truck parked around the side. Another gust of wind hit, this one strong enough to push his rig halfway into the other lane. If there had been oncoming traffic, it would have been a head-on collision. The decision made itself. Caleb hit his turn signal out of habit, though there was no one around to see it, and guided the truck toward the exit. The off-ramp was flooding, water rushing across the asphalt in sheets. He had to fight the wheel to keep the rig straight. The diner's parking lot was gravel, mostly turned to mud by the rain. He pulled in as far from the building as he could, giving himself room to maneuver if he needed to leave quickly. The engine's rumble died as he turned the key, replaced by the drumming of rain on the cab's roof and the howl of wind through the antenna. He sat there for a moment, watching the diner through the waterfall running down his windshield. The neon sign was damaged, only half the letters still working. It should have read Prairie Rose Diner, but now it just said Priered. The windows were lit from inside with a warm yellow glow that looked inviting after the violence of the storm. Caleb grabbed his jacket from behind the seat, a worn Carhartt that had seen better decades, and pulled it on. He'd have to make a run for it. No umbrella was going to help in this sideways rain. He pulled his baseball cap down tight, took a deep breath, and threw open the door. The wind nearly ripped it from his hands. He jumped down from the cab and immediately stepped into ankle-deep water. His boots, good Red Wings that had lasted him 5 years, filled instantly. He slammed the door and ran for the diner, head down against the driving rain. The door was heavier than it looked. Solid wood with a small window at head height. He yanked it open and stumbled inside, bringing a spray of rain with him. The door slammed shut behind him with the help of the wind, and suddenly the storm was muffled, reduced to a distant roar. He stood there dripping on the checkered linoleum floor, breathing hard. The inside of the diner was exactly what you'd expect from the outside. Red vinyl booths, chrome stools along a counter, black and white photographs on the walls showing the place in what must have been its heyday. The air smelled of old grease and fresh coffee, with something else underneath, something musty and forgotten. A jukebox in the corner played a Patsy Cline song. The volume turned low enough that it was almost lost under the sound of the storm. Behind the counter stood a man who had to be the owner. Otto Merrick, according to the name tag on his shirt, though the tag looked as old as everything else in the place. He was probably 70, maybe older, with white hair slicked back with too much pomade and wearing a stained white apron over a flannel shirt. His face had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in the Kansas wind, all deep lines and sun damage. But his eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, watching Caleb with an intensity that didn't match his friendly smile. "Hell of a storm to be driving in," Otto said, his voice carrying a hint of an accent Caleb couldn't quite place. German, maybe, or something Eastern European. "Coffee?" Caleb nodded, still catching his breath. He walked to the counter, his boots squelching with each step, and took a stool near the middle. The vinyl creaked under his weight. Otto was already pouring, the coffee black and steaming in a white mug that had seen better days. Caleb wrapped his hands around it gratefully, letting the heat seep into his cold fingers. "Thanks," he said. "Didn't expect it to get this bad this fast." Otto nodded slowly, refilling his own mug from the pot. "Weather out here has a mind of its own. Always has. You heading west?" "Denver," Caleb said, taking a sip. The coffee was bitter but hot, exactly what he needed. "Got a load that can't wait, apparently." "Nothing can't wait when there's a tornado bearing down," Otto said. "Radio says there's been touchdowns all along Highway 70. You made the right choice stopping." As if to emphasize his point, the lights flickered. The power held, but barely. Caleb could hear the wind picking up outside, a sound like a freight train in the distance. He'd heard that sound before, knew what it meant. He glanced toward the windows, but they were fogged up from the temperature difference between inside and out. All he could see was the occasional flash of lightning painting everything white for a split second. "You got a basement?" Caleb asked. Otto's smile widened slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Storm cellar out back. Built it myself years ago. Reinforced concrete, steel door. Could ride out anything in there." He paused, studying Caleb's face. "But we're not there yet. Storm's still dancing around us, trying to decide which way to go." There was movement in Caleb's peripheral vision. A woman emerged from what must have been the kitchen, pushing through a swinging door. She was younger than Otto by decades, maybe 35, with dishwater blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and wearing a waitress uniform that looked like it belonged in a 1950s movie. Her name tag read Ivy Colburn. She had the kind of face that might have been pretty once, but had been worn down by disappointment and too many long shifts. Her eyes, though, were wrong somehow. They didn't track quite right, like she was looking through things rather than at them. "We have a customer," Otto said to her, though she was already looking at Caleb. "This is Ivy." She helps me keep the place running." Ivy nodded but didn't speak. She moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, wiping down surfaces that already looked clean, arranging silverware that didn't need arranging. Her movements were smooth but mechanical, like she was going through the motions of being a waitress without really being present. "You hungry?" Otto asked. "Kitchen's still open. Ivy makes a mean chicken fried steak." Caleb's stomach rumbled in response. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, just coffee and gas station snacks. "Yeah, that sounds good." Ivy disappeared back into the kitchen without being told. Otto watched her go, then turned back to Caleb. "She doesn't talk much, shy, you know, but she's a good worker. Been with me for, must be 3 years now." Something about the way he said it made Caleb uncomfortable, though he couldn't say why. He took another sip of coffee and changed the subject. "This place, been here long? Don't remember seeing it before." "Longer than you'd think," Otto said. "My father built it in '52, passed it down to me. We used to get a lot more traffic before they put in the interstate. Now it's mostly locals and the occasional trucker who knows where to look." The lights flickered again, longer this time. In the moment of darkness, Caleb could have sworn he saw something move outside the window, a shape darker than the storm. But when the lights came back on, there was nothing there but rain streaming down the glass. Otto didn't seem to notice. He was looking at the ceiling, listening to something. "Wind's shifting," he said quietly. "Coming from the southwest now. That's not good." Caleb knew he was right. Southwest wind meant the storm was rotating, organizing itself into something more dangerous than just a thunderstorm. He thought about his truck out in the parking lot, wondered if he should move it closer to the building, use the diner as a windbreak. But going outside now would be stupid. If there was a tornado forming, the last place he wanted to be was in the open. Ivy returned with his food, setting the plate down in front of him without a word. The chicken fried steak looked good, better than he'd expected from a place like this. Mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans on the side. Real food, not the microwave garbage most truck stops served. He picked up his fork and took a bite. It tasted as good as it looked, the meat tender under its crispy coating, the gravy rich and peppery. "Good?" Otto asked. Caleb nodded, his mouth full. He was hungrier than he'd realized. He ate quickly but steadily, aware of Otto watching him but trying not to show it. Ivy had gone back to her cleaning, moving down the counter with her rag, her movements hypnotic in their repetition. The storm continued to rage outside. At one point, something hit the side of the building hard enough to make everyone jump. Otto went to the window, cupping his hands around his eyes to peer out into the darkness. "Just debris," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Wind's picking up all kinds of things out there." Caleb finished his meal and pushed the plate away. "What do I owe you?" Otto waved his hand dismissively. "On the house. Nobody should have to pay for a meal when they're hiding from God's own wrath." It was an odd way to phrase it, but Caleb wasn't going to argue with free food. He pulled out his phone to check the weather radar, but there was no signal. Not unusual out here, especially during a storm. The tower was probably down, or the weather was interfering with the signal. Still, it made him feel more isolated, cut off from the world. "Phone's not going to work," Otto said, noticing. "Towers always go down in storms like this. We've got a landline if you need to call someone." "Maybe later," Caleb said. There was no one to call, really. His ex wouldn't care if he was in danger, and his kids were teenagers who barely answered his texts, let alone his calls. The jukebox had stopped playing at some point, he realized. The only sound now was the storm and the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. It made the diner feel smaller, more enclosed. Like they were in a bubble, separated from the rest of the world by walls of wind and rain. "You know," Otto said, leaning on the counter, "we had a trucker come through here, must have been 6 months ago. Big fellow, like you. He was running from a storm, too, though not as bad as this one. Stayed the whole night, sleeping in one of the booths. When morning came, he was gone. Left his truck, though. Still sitting out behind the building if you want to see it." Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. "He just left his truck?" Otto nodded slowly. "Happens sometimes. People get spooked by the weather, by the isolation. They abandon things, start fresh somewhere else. Or maybe something else happened to him. Hard to say. We called the company on the side of the truck, but they said they'd never heard of him. Isn't that strange?" Very strange, Caleb thought, but didn't say. Truckers didn't just abandon their rigs. Those trucks were their livelihood, sometimes their homes. You'd have to be desperate or dead to walk away from one. He glanced at Ivy, wondering if she knew more about what had happened to that other trucker, but she was staring out the window at the storm, her reflection in the glass making it look like there were two of her. The lights went out completely this time. The darkness was absolute, so thick Caleb couldn't see his hand in front of his face. He heard Otto moving, the scrape of his shoes on the linoleum, then the click of a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, playing across the walls and ceiling before settling on a door marked "Private" that Caleb hadn't noticed before. "Storm cellars through there and down," Otto said, his voice different in the darkness, lower and more serious. "Might be time to think about heading down." But before anyone could move, the lights flickered back on, weaker than before, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. And in that moment of returning light, Caleb saw someone standing at the window, pressed against the glass, looking in. A face, pale and distorted by the rain, eyes wide and unblinking. Then the figure was gone, vanished into the storm as if it had never been there at all. "Did you see that?" Caleb asked, standing up so fast his stool tipped over. Otto and Ivy exchanged a look, quick but meaningful. "See what?" Otto asked, his tone carefully neutral. Someone was at the window, looking in. Otto walked over to the window, making a show of looking out. "Nobody out there. Nobody'd be out in this weather unless they had to be. Like you." But Caleb knew what he'd seen. Someone had been there, watching them. And from the way Otto and Ivy were acting, they knew it too. They just weren't saying so. He picked up his stool and sat back down, but his muscles were tense now, ready to move if he needed to. The storm outside suddenly seemed like less of a threat than whatever was going on inside this diner. The wind howled louder, and somewhere in the distance, Caleb could hear that freight train sound getting closer. But his eyes kept going to that window, waiting to see if the face would appear again. And in the reflection of the glass, he could see Otto and Ivy watching him, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. The freight train sound was getting closer, and Caleb knew they were running out of time. The windows rattled in their frames, and he could feel the pressure dropping, making his ears pop. Outside, the darkness had taken on a greenish tint that every planes driver knew meant trouble. But Otto and Ivy seemed in no hurry to move toward that storm cellar. They stood there watching him, waiting for something he couldn't understand. "We need to get to shelter," Caleb said, standing up. His wet boots squeaked against the linoleum. "That's not just wind anymore. There's a tornado out there." Otto tilted his head slightly, listening. "Not yet. It's still forming, still deciding. We have a few minutes." He walked behind the counter and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, the kind of cheap bourbon that burned going down. He poured 3 glasses without asking if anyone wanted any. "Helps with the nerves," he said, pushing one toward Caleb. Caleb didn't touch it. Every instinct he'd developed over 12 years on the road was screaming at him that something was wrong here. It wasn't just the storm or the strange behavior of his hosts. It was something deeper, something in the very air of the place. The diner felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "That trucker you mentioned," Caleb said, keeping his voice steady. "The one who left his rig, what was his name?" Otto and Ivy exchanged another one of those looks. "Never got his name," Otto said after a pause. "He wasn't much for talking. Just sat where you're sitting, actually. Ate his meal, waited out the storm. Come morning, like I said, he was gone." "And you didn't think that was worth reporting to the police?" Otto shrugged, the movement casual, but his eyes remained fixed on Caleb. "Police don't come out this way much. Besides, man wants to disappear. That's his business. Lots of people running from something. Maybe he had debts. Maybe he had a wife he wanted to get away from. Maybe he just got tired of the life." The lights flickered again, and in the brief darkness, Caleb heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps on the roof. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking carefully across the rain-slicked surface. But that was impossible. Nobody could be up there in this wind. They'd be blown off in seconds. When the lights came back, Ivy had moved. She was standing by the door to the kitchen now, blocking it with her body. Her face was still blank, but there was something different about her posture. Something protective or maybe defensive. Otto noticed Caleb looking and smiled that smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Old building," he said. "Makes all kinds of noises in a storm, the tin roof especially. Sometimes sounds just like footsteps." But Caleb had been in plenty of old buildings during storms. He knew the difference between structural noise and the sound of someone walking. He stood up slowly, reaching into his pocket for his keys. "I think I'll check on my truck. Make sure the load's secure." "In this weather?" Otto asked, his eyebrows rising. "That would be foolish. You could be hit by debris or worse. Better to stay inside where it's safe." Safe. The word hung in the air between them like a lie nobody believed. Caleb looked toward the window again, and this time he saw it clearly. His truck was still there, barely visible through the rain, but there was someone standing next to it. A figure in what looked like coveralls, just standing there in the storm, not moving despite the wind that should have been knocking them over. "There's someone by my truck," Caleb said, pointing. This time Otto didn't even pretend to look. Probably just shadows. The mind plays tricks in weather like this, sees things that aren't there, misses things that are. That last part sounded like a warning. Caleb backed toward the door, keeping his eyes on both Otto and Ivy. "I'm going to my truck. Thanks for the meal." "You won't make it," Ivy said suddenly, her voice flat and strange like she was reading from a script. "The storm won't let you." It was the first time she'd spoken since he'd arrived, and her voice was wrong somehow, like it was coming from deeper in her throat than it should. Caleb's hand found the door handle behind him. The metal was cold, almost frozen, despite the warm air in the diner. "I'll take my chances," he said. Otto sighed and set down his glass. "You know, Caleb, some storms aren't natural. Some storms are called. Summoned, you might say. By people who know how. People who've been here long enough to learn the old ways." "What the hell are you talking about?" "This land," Otto continued, moving out from behind the counter. "It was never meant for people like you. Outsiders. It belonged to others first, and they knew how to speak to it, how to ask it for favors. My grandfather learned from them, taught my father. My father taught me." The footsteps on the roof were getting louder, more numerous. It sounded like multiple people up there now, walking in circles. The pressure in the room was dropping fast, and Caleb's nose started to bleed, just a trickle he could taste on his lips. "You're both crazy," Caleb said, yanking on the door handle. It didn't budge. The door that had opened easily when he'd entered was now sealed shut, like it had been welded closed. "The door won't open until we want it to," Otto said, his voice conversational, almost apologetic. "That's one of the smaller tricks. The storm, though, that's the real showpiece. It brings people to us, people nobody will miss, people whose companies won't come looking too hard, independent contractors, owner-operators, people who drive alone." Caleb pulled harder on the door, putting his full weight into it. Nothing. Through the window, he could see his truck rocking in the wind, and now there were multiple figures around it, all in those same coveralls, all standing impossibly still despite the hurricane-force winds. "What do you want?" Caleb asked, turning back to face them. His hand went to his pocket knife, though he knew it wouldn't do much good. "Want?" Otto seemed to consider the question. "We want what we've always wanted, to keep this place running, to keep feeding the land what it needs. You see, Caleb, this diner isn't just a building, it's a mouth, and mouths need to eat." The floor beneath Caleb's feet began to vibrate, a low thrumming that he could feel in his bones. The black and white photographs on the walls started to shake, and in them, Caleb could see faces he recognized. Truckers, all of them. Different eras judging by their clothes, but all with the same expression of fear frozen on their faces. "Those aren't old customers," Caleb said, understanding hitting him like a physical blow. "Those are your victims." "Victims is such an ugly word," Ivy said, moving closer. Her movements were still mechanical, but there was something predatory about them now. "They're part of something bigger, part of the diner's history, part of its future." The lights went out again, and this time they stayed out. In the darkness, Caleb could hear things moving. Not just Otto and Ivy, but other things. Wet, sliding sounds like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The smell in the air changed too, from old grease and coffee to something organic and rotting, like a compost heap in summer. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in a red glow that made the shadows dance. Otto and Ivy looked different in this light, their faces longer, their eyes reflecting the red like animal eyes. And behind them, emerging from the kitchen, were others. People in various states of decay, some fresh, some clearly long dead, all wearing the remnants of truckers' clothes. "You see," Otto said, his voice distorting, becoming something inhuman. "We made a deal, my grandfather and the thing that lives beneath this place. It keeps the diner running, keeps us alive far longer than we should be, and in return, we feed it. Every storm brings someone. The storm calls to them, makes them stop here. And then they join our family." Caleb grabbed a stool and swung it at the window. The glass didn't break, didn't even crack. It was like hitting concrete. He swung again and again, but the window held. Outside, the figures by his truck hadn't moved, still standing in their impossible stillness while the storm raged around them. "The glass is special too," Ivy said, almost apologetically. "Everything here is, built to contain, to prevent escape. The trucker who was here 6 months ago, he tried the same thing. Broke his hands trying to punch through. It didn't help." The thing that had been footsteps on the roof was now something else, something heavier and more deliberate. The ceiling began to crack, lines spreading out from the center like a spider web. Something was coming through, something that had been waiting above them all along. Caleb backed into a corner, holding the stool like a weapon. "People will look for me. My company tracks the truck. They'll know I stopped here." Otto laughed, the sound gurgling and wrong. They'll find your truck abandoned on the side of the highway, miles from here. Tornado damage, they'll say. Driver probably got picked up by the wind. Body carried who knows where. Happens all the time in storms like this. And this diner, it doesn't exist on any modern map. Hasn't for decades. People drive right past it unless the storm calls them. The ceiling gave way with a crash, and something descended into the room. It wasn't quite solid, more like a mass of dark flesh and teeth and eyes, constantly shifting and reforming. It filled the space above them, pressing against the walls, making the whole building groan. The smell was overwhelming now, decay and ozone and something older than both. "The land itself is hungry," Otto said, his form beginning to merge with the shadows. "It's been hungry since before humans walked here. We just learned how to be its servants, its providers. And now, Caleb Hensley, you'll help us feed it." The thing from above extended what might have been tentacles or might have been tongues reaching for Caleb. He swung the stool at them, and to his surprise, they recoiled. Metal. The chrome legs of the stool made them pull back, leaving marks in the air like burns. "Iron," Ivy hissed, her face distorting with anger. "He has iron." Caleb didn't understand, but he didn't need to. He kept swinging the stool, creating a small circle of space around himself. The dead truckers pressed closer, but they, too, seemed wary of the chrome. It wasn't much, but it was something. The storm outside was reaching its peak. Through the unbroken window, Caleb could see a funnel cloud forming directly above the diner, its tail reaching down like a finger of God. But it wasn't moving, wasn't traveling the way tornadoes should. It was anchored here, feeding into the thing that had broken through the ceiling. "You can't hold that stool forever," Otto said, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Your arms will tire, your will break, and then you'll join the others. It's not such a bad fate. You'll be part of something eternal." Caleb's arms were already burning from holding the stool up, from swinging it at anything that came too close. His wet clothes were weighing him down, and the loss of blood from his nose was making him dizzy. But he wasn't going to give up. Not like this. He remembered something his grandmother had told him once back when he was a kid in Salina. She'd been full of old stories, old superstitions from the old country. One of them was about crossroads and the things that waited there, about how iron could break their power, but only if you knew the right words. "By iron and blood," Caleb said, not sure if he was remembering it right. "I deny you passage." The effect was immediate. The thing above him pulled back, shrieking in a frequency that made his teeth ache. Otto and Ivy stumbled, their forms becoming more solid, more human. The dead truckers stopped their advance, confusion on their rotting faces. "Old words," Otto snarled, but there was fear in his voice now. "Where did you learn old words?" Caleb didn't answer. He just kept repeating them, over and over, holding the stool high. The chrome seemed to glow in the emergency lighting, or maybe that was his imagination. But the things in the diner were backing away, pressing against the walls, trying to get distance from him and his makeshift weapon. The tornado above them was wavering, its connection to the thing in the ceiling weakening. The building shook, plaster raining down from the walls. Some of the photographs fell, shattering on the floor, and as they did, the corresponding dead trucker would flicker and fade, like they were tied to the images. "You're destroying everything!" Ivy screamed, her mechanical composure finally breaking. "Decades of work! Decades of feeding!" But Caleb kept chanting, kept swinging the stool when anything got too close. He could feel something building, a pressure different from the storm. It was like the diner itself was fighting back, trying to expel him like a splinter from skin. The door behind him exploded outward, ripped from its hinges by a wind that came from inside, not outside. The storm rushed in, But instead of attacking Caleb, it seemed to be pulling the other things out, sucking them into the vortex above. Otto and Ivy clung to the counter, their fingers leaving grooves in the wood, but the pull was too strong. "This isn't over," Otto shouted as he was lifted off his feet. "The land remembers. It always remembers." Then he was gone, pulled up through the hole in the ceiling and into the tornado. Ivy followed, her scream lost in the roar of the wind. The dead truckers were pulled up one by one, their bodies dissolving into the storm like smoke. The thing in the ceiling fought to stay, its mass pressing down even as the tornado pulled up. Caleb could see it clearly now in flashes of lightning, a massive entity that was part flesh, part shadow, part something older than either. It had fed on truckers for decades, maybe longer, growing fat on their fear and flesh, but the iron had broken something fundamental in its connection to this place. The diner was coming apart around it, walls cracking, foundations splitting. The old binding that Otto's grandfather had made was unraveling, and the thing was being pulled back to wherever it had come from. With a final shriek that shattered every piece of glass in the diner except the windows, the thing was sucked up into the tornado. The funnel cloud immediately began to dissipate, the rotation slowing, the tail pulling back up into the clouds. In minutes, it was just a severe thunderstorm again, no longer the supernatural engine of destruction it had been. Caleb dropped the stool, his arms numb, and stumbled toward the destroyed doorway. The rain hit him like a slap, cold and clean after the corrupt air of the diner. His truck was still there, untouched except for being rocked by the wind. No figures in coveralls, no signs of interference. He ran to it, fumbling with his keys, hands shaking so bad it took 3 tries to get the door open. The engine started on the first try, a beautiful sound that meant escape, meant survival. He didn't even check his mirrors, just threw it in gear and pulled out, the trailer fishtailing in the mud. As he reached the highway, he looked back once in his mirror. The diner was collapsing in on itself, the walls folding inward like a house of cards. Lightning struck it repeatedly, each bolt seeming to accelerate its destruction. By the time he'd gone a mile, there was nothing left but a pile of rubble that the rain was already beginning to wash away. He drove through the rest of the storm, hands locked on the wheel, checking his mirrors obsessively for any sign of pursuit. But there was nothing, just rain and wind and the occasional flash of lightning showing empty highway behind him. Caleb drove for 3 hours straight before he finally stopped at a Flying J outside of Colby. His hands were still shaking when he pulled into the lot, parking between 2 other rigs for the illusion of safety. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear night sky that seemed impossible after what he'd been through. Stars scattered across the darkness like broken glass, and the moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light. He sat in his cab for a long time, engine off, just breathing. His clothes were still damp, and he could smell the diner on them, that mixture of old grease and something rotten that he now knew had been death. His nose had stopped bleeding, but dried blood crusted his upper lip. In the overhead light of the cab, he examined his hands. They were scratched and bruised from gripping the stool so tight, and there were marks on his palms that looked almost like burns, perfectly round marks where the chrome legs had pressed into his skin. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him safe on the road for 12 years, was trying to process what had happened, trying to find logical explanations. Gas leak hallucinations, food poisoning, a mental breakdown brought on by stress and the storm. But he knew better. He'd seen what he'd seen, felt what he'd felt. And the marks on his hands were real, throbbing with a dull heat that painkillers wouldn't touch. He reached for his phone, thinking about calling someone, anyone, just to hear a normal voice. But who would believe him? His ex-wife would think he'd started drinking again, though he'd been sober for 5 years. His kids would worry he was losing it, and his company would probably order him in for a drug test and psychological evaluation. Instead, he opened his laptop and started searching. The Prairie Rose Diner, Kansas Highway 70, missing truckers. At first, nothing came up. The diner didn't exist in any business directory, wasn't on any map. But when he started digging deeper, searching through old newspaper archives and trucker forums, he found threads. Whispers. Stories that matched his own. A post from 2018 on a trucker's message board. Anyone else ever see that diner that's only there during storms? West of Oakley. Gave me the creeps, didn't stop. No replies. The thread dead. A newspaper article from '94 buried in the back pages of the Salina Journal. Trucker found wandering highway, claims attack by diner cult. The trucker, one Marcus Tillman, had been found walking along I-70 in his underwear, suffering from exposure and what doctors called acute delusional psychosis. He'd insisted that a diner had tried to eat him, that the owners were feeding the ground. He'd been institutionalized. There was no follow-up story. Going back further required diving into historical archives, microfiche converted to digital. Caleb found a pattern stretching back decades. Truckers vanishing along that stretch of highway, always during severe weather. Their rigs found abandoned, sometimes miles from where they'd last been seen. The official explanations were always mundane. Tornado casualties, voluntary disappearances, accidents. But the timing was too consistent, the location too specific. The oldest reference he could find was from 1952, the year Otto had claimed his father built the diner. It was just a mention in a local paper's police blotter. Concern grows over fourth commercial driver to vanish this spring. State police investigating possible connection to recent tornado activity. But there was no follow-up, no resolution. The stories just stopped, like someone had decided they weren't worth pursuing. Caleb's phone buzzed, making him jump. A text from dispatch. Weather clear. Expected delivery 0800. Confirm en route. He stared at the message for a long time. He could drive on to Denver, deliver his load, pretend nothing had happened. Go back to his life, such as it was. But he knew he'd never drive that stretch of highway again without looking for the diner, without wondering if it would rebuild itself. Call to other truckers in other storms. He texted back. Mechanical issues. Will advise. Then he kept searching. There had to be more. Otto had mentioned his grandfather, said he'd learned from them, the ones who were here first. Native American, probably, though Caleb didn't want to make assumptions. He searched for indigenous histories of the area, stories about the land before it was settled. He found references to a Cheyenne legend about a place where the earth was hungry, where warriors would sometimes disappear during storms. The details were vague, filtered through decades of translation and retelling, but the core was there. A spot of land that was wrong, that demanded sacrifice to keep it quiet. The Cheyenne had avoided it, marked it as cursed. Then white settlers had come, and someone had built a diner right on top of it. Caleb was so absorbed in his research that he didn't notice the figure approaching his truck until a knock on his door made him nearly jump out of his skin. He looked out to see another trucker, an older black man with gray in his beard, looking up at him with concern. "You all right in there, driver?" The man called through the window. "Saw you've been sitting here a while with your light on." Caleb rolled down his window. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep. Storm got me wired." The other trucker nodded knowingly. "That was a bad one. Heard there were touchdowns all along 70. You come through that?" "Yeah," Caleb said, then made a decision. "Hey, you ever heard stories about a diner out that way? Old place? Looks like it's from the 50s? The man's expression changed, became guarded. "Why you asking about that?" "You have heard of it." The trucker looked around the lot, as if checking to see who might be listening, then leaned in closer. "Name's Jerome. Jerome Watkins. Been driving this road for 23 years. And yeah, I've heard stories. Never seen it myself, and I'm grateful for that." "I saw it tonight," Caleb said quietly. "I stopped there." Jerome stared at him for a long moment, then said, "You got lucky. Most who stop there during storms don't drive away. You want to talk about it, really talk about it. There's a diner, a real one, about a mile up the road, Denny's. I'll buy you coffee, and you can tell me what happened." Caleb hesitated, then nodded. He needed to tell someone, and Jerome's reaction suggested he'd believe him. They agreed to meet in 10 minutes, and Jerome walked back to his own rig. The Denny's was bright and normal, full of the usual late-night crowd of travelers and shift workers. They took a booth in the back, and Jerome ordered coffee for both of them. When the waitress was gone, he leaned forward. "Tell me everything," he said. "Don't leave anything out." So Caleb did. He told Jerome about the storm, the diner, Otto, and Ivy, about the thing in the ceiling, and the dead truckers, about the iron and the old words his grandmother had taught him. Jerome listened without interrupting, his face grave. When Caleb finished, Jerome was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, you can't tell anyone else about this. Not officially. They'll think you're crazy. I know. But you also can't let it go. I can see it in your eyes. You want to do something about it." Caleb nodded. "Other truckers are going to drive through there. Other storms are going to come. And if that place rebuilds itself..." Jerome sipped his coffee, thinking. "I know a few people. Drivers who've had experiences, seen things. We don't talk about it much, but we watch out for each other. There's a network, you could say. We share information, mark dangerous spots, warn each other about places to avoid. Like a supernatural CB channel?" Jerome smiled slightly. "Something like that. The thing is, that diner isn't the only bad place out there. There are spots all over the highway system where things aren't right. Places where reality is thin, where old things sleep, where the wrong kind of people set up shop. We've been mapping them, unofficially, trying to keep drivers safe." He pulled out his phone and showed Caleb a map app, but not one from any app store. It was custom, showing the highway system overlaid with markers. Red dots, yellow triangles, black X's. Each one tagged with dates and brief descriptions. The spot where the Prairie Rose Diner had been was marked with a pulsing red X. "This is current?" Caleb asked. "Updated in real time by drivers all over the country. See, you're not the first to encounter something like this, and you won't be the last. But you're one of the few to survive a direct encounter with a feeding ground." "Feeding ground?" Jerome nodded. "Places where something old and hungry lives under the earth. The indigenous peoples knew about them, avoided them, or appeased them. But when colonization happened, that knowledge was lost or ignored. People built on top of these places, and sometimes, like with your diner, they made deals with what lived below. Otto said his grandfather learned from them, the ones who were here first. Probably did, Jerome said. But he learned the wrong lessons. Instead of avoiding the thing, he tried to use it, feed it, control it. That never ends well, though it can last a long time if you're willing to pay the price." They talked until dawn, Jerome sharing stories from other drivers, other encounters. A rest stop in Nevada where people walked in, but different people walked out. A bridge in West Virginia where trucks would stall for no reason, and drivers would see things in their mirrors that weren't there when they turned around. A stretch of highway in Texas, where the road itself would sometimes lead you somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't on any map. "The highways are liminal spaces," Jerome explained. places between places. That makes them vulnerable to things that exist between. Most of the time, nothing happens. But sometimes, especially during storms, or at certain times of year, the barriers get thin. So, what do we do about it? Caleb asked. We survive. We warn others. And sometimes, like you did tonight, we fight back. That iron trick your grandmother taught you? That's old protection. Real protection. Salt works too, and certain prayers if you believe in them. But mostly, we just try to avoid these places. Jerome transferred the app to Caleb's phone, along with the contact information for other drivers in the network. Check in when you can, he said. Let us know what you see out there, and if you ever encounter something like that diner again, run, Caleb finished, fast as you can. They parted ways as the sun came up, Jerome heading east, Caleb finally continuing west to Denver. He delivered his load 6 hours late, blaming mechanical problems, and took the write-up without complaint. His supervisor threatened suspension if it happened again, but Caleb barely heard him. His mind was elsewhere, on that map full of marked dangers, on the network of drivers who knew the truth about what was out there. He thought about quitting, finding some other job that didn't involve driving through places where reality wore thin. But he knew he wouldn't. Someone had to keep watch. Someone had to warn others. And now that he knew what was out there, he couldn't unknow it. 3 weeks later, he was driving through Nebraska when his phone pinged with an alert from the network. A driver had reported strange lights at a rest stop ahead, lights that moved wrong, that called to you. Caleb took the next exit, added 20 miles to his route to avoid it. He thought about the driver who'd sent the warning, whoever they were, and felt grateful. 6 weeks after that, he sent his own first warning. A gas station in Wyoming where the attendant's reflection didn't match his movements, where the pumps dispensed something that looked like gas but smelled like copper. 2 drivers responded, thanking him, saying they'd avoid it. It became routine, in a way. Check the map before each run, plan routes that avoided the marked places, share information with the network. Most drives were normal, boring even. But sometimes, especially during storms or late at night when the roads were empty, he'd see things, feel things, and he'd know that what happened at the Prairie Rose Diner wasn't unique. But the diner itself haunted him. He'd drive past that spot on I-70 sometimes, when the route demanded it. During the day, in clear weather, there was nothing there but an empty field. No sign that anything had ever been built there. But once, during another spring storm, he thought he saw lights in the distance, a red neon glow that shouldn't exist. He didn't stop. Didn't even slow down. But in his mirrors, just for a moment, he could have sworn he saw Otto standing by the side of the road, watching him pass. Still wearing that stained apron, still smiling that smile that didn't reach his eyes. When Caleb looked again, there was nothing there but rain and darkness. The marks on his palms never fully healed. They faded to white scars, perfect circles that ached whenever a storm was coming. His grandmother would have called them witch marks, signs of an encounter with something otherworldly. Caleb just called them reminders. Reminders that the road wasn't always just asphalt and white lines. Sometimes it was a threshold to places that shouldn't exist, where hungry things waited for travelers who didn't know any better. He started carrying an iron crowbar behind his seat, right next to the aluminum bat he'd already had. Salt packets from fast food restaurants filled his glove compartment. He learned prayers in 3 different languages, not sure if he believed in any of them, but willing to try anything that might help. Other drivers in the network shared their own protections: silver coins, sage bundles, symbols from a dozen different faiths. "We're like medieval travelers," Jerome told him once during another late-night coffee session. "Warding off evil with whatever we can find, hoping it's enough." It was exactly 1 year later when Caleb got the call that changed everything. He was at home in Salina, enjoying a rare 3-day break, when his phone rang at 2 a.m. The number was unfamiliar, but something made him answer it anyway. Maybe it was the time. Calls at that hour were never good news. Or maybe it was the feeling he'd had all day, like static electricity building before a storm. Caleb Hensley? The voice was female, young, scared. Yeah, who's this? My name is Sarah Pruitt. Jerome Watkins gave me your number. Said you were the one who destroyed the Prairie Rose Diner last year. Caleb sat up in bed, instantly alert. What about it? It's back. The words hit him like ice water. He'd been checking that spot regularly on his routes, and there had been nothing there but empty field for 12 months. That's impossible. I'm here right now, Sarah said, and he could hear wind in the background, the sound of a storm building. I can see it, same place, same red neon sign, but it looks different, newer, stronger, and there are already 3 trucks in the parking lot. Caleb was already out of bed, pulling on his jeans. Get out of there. Don't stop, don't even slow down. I can't just leave those other drivers. Yes, you can. That place will kill you. Drive away now. There was a pause, then. One of them is my brother. His truck's been missing for 2 days. The company's GPS showed it moving in circles around this area, then it just stopped. I came looking for him, and the diner's here. His truck is here. Caleb closed his eyes. He understood. Family was family. Are you in your vehicle? Yes. A pickup. I'm parked on the shoulder about 100 yards away. Stay there. Don't approach the diner. I'm 2 hours away. I'm coming. What are you going to do? He thought about the iron crowbar behind his seat, the salt in his glove compartment, the words his grandmother had taught him. They'd worked once, but barely, and Sarah said the place looked stronger now. I don't know yet, but I'm coming. Whatever you do, don't go inside. Promise me. I promise, she said. But he could hear the lie in her voice. She was going to try to save her brother the moment they hung up. Sarah, listen to me. That thing feeds on people who enter during storms. It's not just a building, it's a mouth. Your brother might already be— Don't say it, she cut him off. Just hurry. The line went dead. Caleb tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. The storm was probably interfering with cell towers. Or worse, the diner was affecting electronics in the area. He grabbed his keys, his jacket, and his phone, then stopped by his closet. In the back, wrapped in an old blanket, was something he'd bought 6 months ago from an antique dealer who specialized in what she called protective items. It was an iron railroad spike from the 1800s, blessed by 3 different religious leaders and inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The dealer had claimed it could pierce through dimensional barriers, whatever that meant. Caleb had bought it because holding it made his palm scars ache in a way that felt like recognition, like the marks knew what it was. He also grabbed a bag of road salt from his garage and a can of spray paint. If the diner was back, others needed to be warned. The network needed to know. But first, he had to try to help Sarah and her brother. The drive to the diner's location normally took 2 hours. Caleb made it in 90 minutes, pushing his pickup to its limits. He'd left his rig at home. This wasn't a job for 18 wheels and a trailer. This was personal now. The storm hit him about 30 miles out, rain coming down so hard he could barely see. Lightning strobed across the sky, and the wind tried to push him off the road more than once. His phone buzzed with alerts from the network. Other drivers were reporting strange things happening all along I-70. Trucks stalling for no reason. Radios picking up transmissions from years ago. One driver swore he'd passed the same exit 6 times before finally getting past it. The diner wasn't just back. Its influence was spreading. When he finally reached the right spot, his headlights caught Sarah's pickup first, still parked on the shoulder where she'd said it would be. Empty. The driver's door was open, rain pouring into the cab. Beyond it, set back from the highway like it had always been there, was the Prairie Rose Diner. But Sarah had been right. It was different. The building looked newer, more solid, more real. The neon sign was fully functional now, blazing red against the storm-dark sky. Every window was lit from within, showing warm yellow light that promised comfort and safety from the storm. It was a better lie than before, more convincing. And there were indeed 3 semis in the parking lot plus a 4th vehicle. A sedan that hadn't been there when Sarah called. Caleb parked behind Sarah's pickup and grabbed his supplies. The railroad spike went in his jacket pocket, heavy and cold against his ribs. The crowbar was in his right hand, the salt bag in his left. The spray paint was in his back pocket. He thought about calling Jerome, calling the network, but there wasn't time. People were in there. Sarah was in there. The walk to the diner felt longer than it should have, like the distance was stretching. The rain hit him like fists, and the wind tried to turn him around, push him back to his truck. But he kept walking, focusing on the lights ahead. As he got closer, he could hear music, that same Patsy Cline song from before, playing on a loop. The door was exactly as he remembered it. Heavy wood with a small window. He could see shapes moving inside, but the glass was fogged up. He tried the handle, expecting resistance, but it opened easily. Too easily. They were expecting him. The interior was immaculate, not just clean, but pristine, like it had just been built yesterday. The chrome gleamed, the vinyl was uncracked. The photographs on the walls showed happy customers from what looked like the 1950s. But Caleb knew better. He could see it in the faces if he looked close enough. The strain around the eyes, the too wide smiles. These were people trying to look happy because something was making them. There were 5 people at the counter. 3 truckers, all men, sitting perfectly still with cups of coffee in front of them. They didn't turn when he entered, didn't acknowledge him at all. Just sat there, staring straight ahead. Sarah was at the end of the counter, and she at least looked at him when he came in, her eyes wide with fear, but also relief. And behind the counter were Otto and Ivy. They looked exactly the same as they had a year ago. Not similar, identical. Same clothes, same hairstyles, same expressions. Otto's smile was still cold, and Ivy's movements were still mechanical. The only difference was their eyes. Before, they'd been human eyes, even if the humans behind them were corrupted. Now they were black, completely black, like pools of oil. "Caleb Hensley," Otto said, his voice carrying an echo it hadn't had before, like multiple people speaking in unison. "We've been waiting for you." "Let them go," Caleb said, not moving from the doorway. "All of them. They came here of their own free will," Otto replied. "During a storm seeking shelter, the old compact applies. They're ours now. The diner was destroyed. I saw it collapse." Otto's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "You destroyed a building, but we are not the building. We are what lives beneath it, what has always lived here. The diner is just a shell, a lure. It can be rebuilt. It has been rebuilt, and it will be rebuilt again if necessary." Ivy moved down the counter, refilling coffee cups that were already full. The liquid that poured from the pot wasn't coffee. It was too thick, too dark, and it moved wrong. "You cost us a year of feeding," she said, her voice also echoing. "The land is so hungry now, so angry. It needs more than we used to give it." "How many?" Caleb asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. 3 tonight, Otto said, gesturing to the truckers. "Plus your friend here, plus you. That might be enough to calm it for a while." "Her brother, which one is he?" Otto pointed to the middle trucker, a young man with sandy hair and a cowboy's cap. He looked normal except for his complete stillness and the fact that he hadn't blinked once since Caleb entered. "Tom," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "His name is Tom Pruitt. He's only 23. Please, he has a wife, a baby." "The land doesn't care about such things," Ivy said. "It only cares about the feeding." Caleb took a step forward and immediately felt pressure, like walking into water. The air itself was thick, resistant. "I broke your binding once. I can do it again." "With iron and old words?" Otto laughed, and the sound was like grinding stone. "We learned from that. We made new bindings, stronger ones. The land itself agrees to them now. You'd need more than a grandmother's folklore to break them." That's when Caleb pulled out the railroad spike. The moment it cleared his pocket, the temperature in the diner dropped 20 degrees. Otto and Ivy both stepped back, their oil-black eyes widening. Even the truckers stirred slightly like sleepers beginning to wake. "What is that?" Otto hissed. "Iron from the first violation," Caleb said, remembering what the antique dealer had told him. When they drove the railroads through sacred land, through places that should have been left alone. This spike was part of that. It carries the memory of breaking boundaries that shouldn't be broken. And sometimes, that's exactly what you need. He didn't wait for them to respond. He drove the spike into the floor with all his strength. The linoleum cracked, split, and beneath it was not concrete or wood, but something organic and dark, like exposed muscle. The spike sank in deep, and the diner screamed. It wasn't a human scream or even an animal one. It was the sound of something fundamental being torn, like reality itself was in pain. The walls began to ripple, the photographs falling and shattering. The pristine surfaces started to age rapidly, chrome rusting, vinyl cracking, wood rotting. Otto and Ivy rushed at him, moving faster than humans should be able to move. But Caleb was ready with the crowbar, swinging it in a wide arc that caught Otto in the chest. There was a sound like breaking glass, and Otto's form shattered into black fragments that dissolved before they hit the ground. Ivy grabbed his throat with hands that felt like ice, her black eyes inches from his. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice desperate now. "Without us to feed it, to control it, it will eat everything, the whole town, the whole county." Caleb brought his knee up into her stomach and she doubled over. He pushed her away and grabbed the bag of salt, tearing it open and starting to pour it in a circle around the spike. The salt hissed and steamed when it hit the floor, and the organic surface beneath the linoleum began to retreat from it. The truckers were waking up now, shaking their heads, looking confused. Sarah ran to her brother, helping him off his stool. "We need to go," she said to Caleb. "Now." But Caleb wasn't done. He pulled out the spray paint and wrote on the wall in large red letters, "Danger. Do not stop. Feeding ground." Then he added the date and his name. Evidence, warning, testimony. The diner was coming apart around them now. Not collapsing like before, but unraveling, like it was being pulled back to wherever it had come from. Ivy was on her knees by the counter, her form flickering between human and something else. Something made of shadow and teeth. "The land will remember," she said, echoing Otto's last words from a year ago. "It always remembers, and it will call others to serve it." "Then others will stop them," Caleb said. He helped Sarah get the truckers moving, all of them stumbling like drunks as whatever had held them released its grip. They made it to the door just as the ceiling began to cave in, not from above, but from below, like the building was being swallowed by the earth. They ran through the storm to their vehicles. The truckers climbed into their rigs, started their engines with shaking hands. Sarah got Tom into her pickup, supporting him as he walked. Caleb made sure everyone was moving before he got in his own truck. As he started the engine, he looked back one last time. The diner was gone, but the ground where it had stood was wrong. It pulsed like a wound, and things moved beneath the surface. Then the rain washed over it, and it was just an empty lot again, innocent-looking in the lightning flashes. He followed the convoy of vehicles to the nearest town, making sure everyone made it to safety. At a 24-hour McDonald's, they sat in a booth, drinking coffee that was actually coffee, trying to process what had happened. The truckers didn't remember much, just stopping for shelter, then waking up when the place started falling apart. Tom remembered even less, just 2 days of vague dreams about being underground. Sarah was the only one who'd seen what Caleb had seen, who knew the full truth. "Will it come back again?" she asked quietly while the others were distracted. "Probably," Caleb admitted. "But it'll take time. And now more people know about it. The network will watch that spot. We'll warn others." "The network?" He explained about the informal system of drivers who tracked these things, who tried to keep the roads safe from hazards that weren't on any official map. Sarah listened intently, then asked to join. Her brother had almost been taken. She wanted to help prevent it from happening to others. Over the next few months, that stretch of I-70 became one of the most monitored sections of highway in the network. Drivers would take photos of the empty lot where the diner appeared, documenting that it was still gone. Any unusual activity was immediately reported. The spray-painted warning Caleb had left was photographed before the wind and rain washed it away, becoming a piece of evidence in the network's unofficial archives. But Caleb knew it wasn't over. The land itself was the problem, not the building that appeared on it. Otto and Ivy had been right about one thing. It was hungry, and it would keep being hungry. Someone else would eventually be drawn to that spot, would try to make a deal with what lived below, and the cycle would start again. He thought about his grandmother's stories more often now. She'd grown up in the old country, in a village that had its own hungry ground, a forest that would take children who wandered too far from home. The villagers had learned to live with it, to respect it, to give it what it needed without letting it take everything. But Americans didn't think that way. They built on cursed ground, tried to control forces they didn't understand, and then acted surprised when things went wrong. 6 months after the second destruction of the diner, Caleb was driving through Nebraska when his phone pinged with an alert. Not from the network this time, but from Sarah. She'd been doing her own research, diving into historical records and indigenous accounts. She'd found something. "The Cheyenne had a ceremony," she told him when he called her back. "Something they did to quiet hungry grounds. It didn't destroy them. Nothing can destroy them. But it put them to sleep. Deep sleep. For generations. Do you know how to do it?" "No, but I know someone who might. A Cheyenne elder named Robert Whitecrow. He lives on the reservation in Montana. He's willing to talk to us, but only in person." Caleb thought about it. It would mean taking time off, driving to Montana, possibly learning things he wasn't sure he wanted to know. But then he thought about all the truckers who'd vanished over the years, about Chiuse, Tom Pruitt's near miss, about the others who might encounter that place in the future. "When do we go?" he asked. They met a week later in Billings and drove together to the reservation. Robert Whitecrow was ancient, his face a map of wrinkles, his eyes clouded with cataracts. But his voice was strong when he spoke, and he knew exactly why they'd come. "The hungry grounds have always been here," he said, sitting in his small living room surrounded by photographs of family and ancestors. "Since before humans, maybe since the earth itself was young. They're not evil exactly, they're just hungry, always hungry. My people learned to recognize them, to avoid them, to appease them when necessary." "Can they be put to sleep?" Sarah asked. Robert nodded slowly. There is a way, but it requires sacrifice, not human sacrifice, he added quickly, seeing their expressions. But something valuable must be given, something that connects the person to the land. And the ceremony must be done by someone who has already faced the hungry ground and survived, someone it recognizes. He looked directly at Caleb when he said this. They spent 3 days on the reservation, learning the ceremony. It was complex, involving specific movements, words in Cheyenne that Caleb struggled to pronounce, and the burial of certain items at the cardinal points around the affected area. The sacrifice Robert mentioned turned out to be blood, just a small amount, but from someone who'd survived the ground's hunger. It would recognize the blood, respect it, and accept the offer of sleep. It won't last forever, Robert warned. Maybe 50 years, maybe 100. Eventually, it will wake again. But it gives time. Time for people to forget about that place, to let the roads change, to maybe bypass it entirely. Caleb and Sarah drove back to Kansas with everything they needed. They waited for a clear night, no storms to activate the ground's hunger. The spot looked innocent in the starlight, just an empty field by the highway. But Caleb could feel it watching as they worked, recognizing him, remembering their previous encounters. They placed the items Robert had given them, sage bundles, obsidian arrows, small leather pouches filled with earth from sacred places, at the 4 cardinal points. Caleb spoke the words, stumbling over the pronunciation but feeling their power nonetheless, and at the end, he cut his palm with a ritual knife, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the ground at the center of where the diner had stood. The earth shuddered just once, like something massive turning over in its sleep. Then stillness. A deep, profound stillness that hadn't been there before. The constant sense of being watched, of something waiting, was gone. They stood there for a while, making sure it had worked. Then, Sarah spray-painted a new message on a nearby road sign. Safe passage. Sleeping ground. Do not disturb. She added the date and both their names. Think it'll hold? She asked. For a while, Caleb said, looking at his scarred palms. The circular marks were fading finally after 1.5 years. Long enough for us, anyway. They drove away together, heading in opposite directions when they reached the next town. Sarah was going back to her brother to make sure he was still recovering. Caleb was heading to Denver, finally completing a delivery route he'd started over 1 year ago. But they stayed in touch, part of the network now, watching the roads for other hungry grounds, other places where reality was thin. Because the Prairie Rose Diner wasn't unique. It was just one mouth of many, scattered across the highway system, waiting for storms and strangers. Caleb still drives that stretch of I-70 sometimes. The ground remains quiet, sleeping as promised, but he always checks his mirrors when he passes, always listens for that Patsy Cline song on the radio, always watches for red neon in storms. Because he knows that somewhere, in some other location, another diner is waiting. Another Otto and Ivy are serving coffee that isn't coffee. Another hungry ground is feeding. The road is long and full of monsters. But now, at least, some drivers know to watch for them. And sometimes, knowing is enough to keep you safe. Sometimes. The railroad spike sits in a glass case in Caleb's apartment now, a reminder and a warning. Next to it is a photo Sarah took of the empty lot after they'd completed the ceremony. If you look closely at the photo, in just the right light, you can see the outline of where the diner used to stand, like a scar on the earth. And sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep, Caleb swears he can still smell that diner smell on his clothes. Old grease and coffee and something else, something that smells like earth and hunger and things that should stay buried. But the ground sleeps. For now, the ground sleeps. And Caleb keeps driving, keeps watching, keeps warning others about the places where the road turns strange. Because that's what you do when you've seen behind the curtain of reality. You help others see it too, so they can avoid it. Or survive it if they can't. Jeremiah Talcott had been driving through the worst of Oklahoma's weather for 15 years, but he'd never seen a storm system like the one that rolled in that September evening. It started as a line of black clouds on the western horizon, moving faster than any natural weather should move, swallowing the sunset like a living thing. The radio had been crackling with emergency broadcasts for the past hour, each one more urgent than the last. Tornado watches had become warnings, and now they were telling everyone to seek immediate shelter. But Jeremiah was hauling a refrigerated load of medical supplies from Dallas to Kansas City, and the hospitals waiting for those supplies didn't care about weather warnings. Blood products, insulin, antibiotics, things that people would die without if they didn't arrive on time. His dispatcher had made it clear that this delivery couldn't be delayed, storm or no storm. The company would cover any damages to the truck, they said, but the load had to get through. He was on Highway 69, about 30 miles south of McAllister, when the first wall of rain hit. It wasn't gradual. One moment he could see the road, the next he was driving through a waterfall. His windshield wipers, even on their highest setting, were useless. He slowed to 20 miles per hour, then 15, then 10. The trailer behind him swayed dangerously in the crosswinds, and he could hear the refrigeration unit struggling to maintain temperature in the bizarre pressure changes. Lightning struck so close that his CB radio exploded in a shower of sparks. The cab filled with the smell of burning electronics and ozone. He pulled his hand back from the microphone just in time, feeling the hair on his arms standing straight up from the static charge. Without the CB, he was cut off from other truckers, from dispatch, from any warning about what was ahead. That's when he saw the lights through the rain, not the harsh white of modern streetlights, but the warm yellow glow of old-fashioned lamps. A town, though he didn't remember any town being on this stretch of highway. He'd driven this route dozens of times, always at night to avoid traffic, and this section was supposed to be nothing but ranch land and oil fields for 50 miles in any direction. But there it was, clear as day through the storm. A small cluster of buildings huddled against the weather, lights glowing in windows, and what looked like people moving on the streets despite the danger. A hand-painted sign by the road, barely visible through the rain, read, "Welcome to Temperance. Population 247, founded 1889. Jeremiah had never heard of Temperance, Oklahoma, and he prided himself on knowing every town, every stop, every speed trap along his regular routes. But right now he didn't care about the mystery. His truck was being pushed sideways by wind gusts that had to be approaching 100 miles per hour. He needed shelter before the whole rig was blown over. The exit ramp appeared suddenly in his headlights, as if it had materialized just for him. He took it, feeling the truck slide on the flooded asphalt but managing to keep control. The road into town was narrow, lined with trees that bent almost horizontal in the wind. Debris flew across his path. Branches, pieces of metal siding, what looked like an entire chicken coop tumbling end over end. The town's main street was surreal in its normalcy. Despite the apocalyptic weather, shops were open, lights on in every window. People stood under awnings and in doorways, watching his truck pass with expressions he couldn't quite read through the rain-blurred glass. Nobody was running for shelter. Nobody seemed panicked. They just stood there, watching, as if a massive truck arriving in the middle of the worst storm in decades was exactly what they'd been expecting. He found what looked like a truck stop at the edge of the small downtown area. Though calling it that was generous. It was really just a large gravel lot with a diesel pump that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. But it had something more valuable than modern amenities. A large metal building, probably an old machinery shed, with its doors standing open like an invitation. Jeremiah carefully maneuvered his rig into the building, having to fold in his mirrors to clear the doorway. The moment his trailer cleared the entrance, 2 men appeared and pushed the massive doors closed behind him. The sudden cessation of wind and rain was almost disorienting. He could still hear the storm, but it was muffled now, reduced to a distant roar. He sat in his cab for a moment, hands shaking from the adrenaline of the drive, before shutting down the engine. The refrigeration unit would run on its separate diesel tank for at least 12 hours, keeping the medical supplies at the proper temperature. He climbed down from the cab, his legs unsteady after the tension of fighting the storm. The 2 men who'd closed the doors were standing there waiting for him. Both looked to be in their 60s, wearing overalls and work shirts that belonged to another era. Their faces were weathered but alert, watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Hell of a storm to be driving in," the taller one said. His voice had a strange quality to it, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Lucky you found us." "I didn't know there was a town here," Jeremiah said, trying to keep his voice casual. "I've driven this route for years." The 2 men exchanged a look that was gone too quickly for Jeremiah to interpret. "Temperance has always been here," the shorter one said. "People just don't always see it. Takes the right conditions." Before Jeremiah could ask what that meant, a woman entered the building through a side door. She was probably 40, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and wearing a sheriff's uniform that looked authentic except for details that were slightly wrong. The badge was the wrong shape for Oklahoma. The patches were from no department he recognized. "I'm Sheriff Boone Caffrey," she said, extending her hand. The name didn't match the person at all, and it took Jeremiah a moment to realize she was serious. A female sheriff named Boone in a town he'd never heard of. He shook her hand anyway, noting how cold her skin was despite the humid warmth of the night. "Jeremiah Talcott," he replied. "I'm just looking to wait out the storm. Soon as it passes, I'll be on my way." Sheriff Caffrey smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Storm's not passing anytime soon. This is one of those systems that likes to sit and spin. Could be here for days. You'd best come into town proper. Get yourself a room at the hotel, some food in your belly. Your truck will be safe here. Earl and Curtis will watch it." She gestured to the 2 men, who nodded in unison. Jeremiah wanted to refuse, wanted to stay with his truck and its valuable cargo. But something about the way all 3 of them were looking at him made it clear that refusing wasn't really an option. "I need to check the refrigeration unit every few hours," he said. "Of course," Sheriff Caffrey said smoothly. "You can come back whenever you need. The hotel's just a 5-minute walk. Come on, I'll show you the way." He grabbed his overnight bag from the cab, locked the truck even though he suspected locks meant nothing here, and followed the sheriff out into the storm. The wind hit him immediately, trying to tear the bag from his hand, but Sheriff Caffrey walked through it like it was a gentle breeze. She didn't even hold on to her hat. The walk to the hotel took them down Main Street, past storefronts that belonged in a museum. A barber shop with a spinning pole that somehow kept spinning despite the wind. A general store with goods in the window that hadn't been manufactured in decades. A diner that was packed with people, all sitting still at their tables, all turning to watch as Jeremiah passed. "Busy night," he commented, having to shout over the wind. "Storm brings everyone together," Sheriff Caffrey replied, her voice somehow carrying perfectly despite speaking at a normal volume. "It's like a holiday for us, a celebration." The hotel was called the Temperance Inn, a 3-story building that looked like it had been lifted straight from the 1890s. The wooden sign above the door swung violently in the wind, making a rhythmic creaking that sounded almost like voices. Sheriff Caffrey held the door for him, and he stepped into a lobby that smelled of old wood and something else, something medicinal and sharp. Behind the desk was a woman who could have been anywhere from 50 to 80, her face one of those ageless masks that some people wear. She smiled at Jeremiah, and he noticed her teeth were perfect, too perfect, like dentures that didn't quite fit. "This is Ruth Ann Winslow," Sheriff Caffrey said. "She runs the inn. Ruth Ann, Mr. Talcott needs a room for the night. Maybe longer, depending on the storm." Ruth Ann's smile widened. "Of course. We've been expecting someone. Room 237 is all ready. Second floor, end of the hall, best room in the house." She handed him an actual metal key, not a key card, attached to a wooden tag with the room number burned into it. "How much for the night?" Jeremiah asked, reaching for his wallet. "Oh, we'll settle up when you leave," Ruth Ann said. "No point counting costs until we know how long you'll be with us." Something about the way she said it made it sound like his length of stay had already been determined, and not by him. But he was tired, stressed from the drive, and the idea of a bed sounded better than sleeping in his cab during a storm. Sheriff Caffrey tipped her hat. "I'll leave you to get settled. If you need anything, anyone in town can help you. We're all very helpful here in Temperance." She left, the door slamming shut behind her with a bang that made Jeremiah jump. Ruth Ann was still watching him with that too-wide smile. "Dinner's served in the dining room until 9, she said. "Though, with a storm like this, we might keep the kitchen open later. Storms make people hungry." Jeremiah climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step creaking under his weight. The hallway was lit by ancient-looking light fixtures that flickered with every lightning strike. The carpet was a deep red that might have once been elegant, but now looked like dried blood in the uncertain light. Room 237 was at the end of the hall, just as Ruth Ann had said. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door opened into a room that was surprisingly large and well-appointed. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, with heavy curtains that could be drawn for privacy. A writing desk sat by the window, and through the glass he could see the storm raging, transforming the town into a watercolor painting of blurred lights and shadows. He set his bag on the bed and tried his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising given the weather. The room had no phone, no television, no radio. The only modern convenience was electric lighting, and even that seemed uncertain, flickering with increasing frequency. A knock at the door made him jump. He opened it to find a young woman, maybe 20, with long dark hair and wearing what looked like a maid's uniform from a period film. She was holding a tray with a steaming pot of coffee and a plate of sandwiches. "Ruth Ann thought you might be hungry after your drive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said the storm makes travelers hungry." "Thanks," Jeremiah said, taking the tray. The girl turned to leave, then paused. "Don't go out during the feeding," she said quickly, so quietly he almost missed it. "The what?" But she was already hurrying down the hall, practically running. He called after her, but she disappeared down the stairs without looking back. Jeremiah closed the door and set the tray on the desk. The sandwiches looked normal enough. Ham and cheese, lettuce and tomato. The coffee smelled like coffee. But the girl's warning echoed in his mind. The feeding? What did that mean? He ate mechanically, more out of necessity than hunger, watching the storm through the window. The town below looked different from this vantage point. He could see patterns in the way people moved on the streets, despite the weather. They weren't random. They were gathering, forming groups, all moving in the same direction, toward the center of town. By 8:30, the movement had become a procession. Dozens of people, maybe the entire population of Temperance, walking through the storm with purpose. They carried lanterns that somehow stayed lit despite the wind and rain. From his window, Jeremiah could see them converging on what looked like a town square he hadn't noticed before, with some kind of structure in the center. He was debating whether to go downstairs and ask Ruth Ann what was happening when the lights went out. Not just in his room, the entire town went dark except for those bobbing lanterns. In the darkness, with only lightning to illuminate the scene, what he saw in the town square made his blood run cold. The structure in the center wasn't a monument or a gazebo. It was a massive metal framework, like a giant birdcage, and there was something inside it. Something that moved with too many limbs, something that the townspeople were approaching with their lanterns raised high. Then the lights came back on, and the square was empty. No crowd, no lanterns, no cage, just rain and wind and the normal chaos of a storm. Jeremiah blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. Nothing. It was as if he'd imagined the whole thing, but he knew he hadn't. Something was fundamentally wrong with Temperance, something that went beyond just being an oddly isolated town. He needed to get back to his truck, check on his cargo, and get out of here as soon as the storm broke, even if it meant driving through dangerous conditions. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, but when he tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the outside. He tried his key, but it no longer fit in the lock, as if the mechanism had been changed while he wasn't looking. Panic rising in his throat, he went to the window. It was painted shut, layers and layers of paint sealing it closed. He could break it, but it was a straight drop to the street below, and he could see people gathering again, looking up at his window as if they knew he was watching. Sheriff Caffrey was among them, and she raised her hand in what might have been a wave or might have been a warning. Beside her stood Ruth Ann Winslow and the two men from the truck stop, Earl and Curtis. All of them looking up at his window, all of them smiling. The lights went out again, and this time they stayed out. In the darkness, Jeremiah could hear something that wasn't the storm. It was a rhythmic pounding, like a massive heartbeat, coming from somewhere below the town. And with each beat, he could hear voices, hundreds of them, chanting in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood in his bones. They were calling something, summoning it. And whatever it was answering. The room grew cold, so cold his breath misted in the air. Frost began forming on the inside of the window, creating patterns that looked almost like writing, like warnings in a language that predated words. And in those patterns, Jeremiah saw images. Other truckers, other travelers, others who had sought shelter in Temperance during storms. None of them had left. The pounding grew louder, and now he could feel it through the floor, through the walls, through his bones. The entire building was shaking. Not from the wind, but from something rising from beneath. Something that had been sleeping, waiting for the right conditions, waiting for the storm, waiting for the feeding. Jeremiah backed away from the window, looking for anything he could use as a weapon, anything that might help him escape. But the room that had seemed so normal just hours ago now felt like a trap that had been prepared specifically for him. Even the furniture seemed hostile, the shadows they cast reaching toward him like grasping fingers. Then he heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured, deliberate. Not the footsteps of one person but many, all walking in perfect synchronization. They stopped outside his door, and he could see shadows moving in the gap beneath it. Many shadows, far too many for the narrow hallway. A voice spoke, and he recognized it as Ruth Ann's, though it sounded different now, older, more primal. "Mr. Talcott, it's time. The storm has accepted you. The town has accepted you. Now you must accept your purpose." "What do you want?" Jeremiah called out. Surprised his voice was steady despite the terror coursing through him. "Want?" Ruth Ann laughed, and it sounded like wind through broken glass. "We don't want anything. We are simply the mechanism. Every storm brings an offering. The land demands it, has demanded it since before this town was built. We built the town to focus that demand, to control it, to satisfy it with precision rather than random destruction." "You're talking about human sacrifice," Jeremiah said, his mind reeling. "Such a crude term," Sheriff Caffrey's voice now closer to the door. "Think of it as an exchange. One life given willingly or not to save hundreds. Without our offerings, the storms would devastate the entire state. We hold them here, contain them, feed them what they need to move on." "That's insane." "Is it?" Ruth Ann asked. "How many people die in tornadoes each year? How many towns are destroyed? We've had exactly 0 storm deaths in Temperance in over a century. Our crops never fail. Our buildings never fall. The storm protects us, and we feed it. It's a simple transaction." The doorknob began to turn, slowly, even though Jeremiah knew it was locked. The lock itself was changing, morphing, becoming something else. The door began to open, and he could see them in the hallway. Not just Ruth Ann and Sheriff Caffrey, but dozens of townspeople all standing impossible close together, all staring at him with eyes that reflected light like a cat's. But there was something else, too. Behind them, filling the hallway like smoke, was a presence. Not quite visible, but undeniably there. It smelled of ozone and earth, of rain and deep places that had never seen sunlight. And it was hungry. So terribly, impossibly hungry. "The storm chooses," Ruth Ann said, stepping into the room. "It called you here, made you see our town when thousands of others have driven past without noticing. You were selected, Mr. Talcott. It's an honor, really." Jeremiah grabbed the desk chair, holding it between himself and the advancing crowd. "My truck, the medical supplies, people need them. Your truck will be found on the highway after the storm passes," Sheriff Caffrey said matter-of-factly. "Tragic accident. Driver lost in the tornado. The supplies will get through eventually. A small delay in exchange for hundreds of lives saved from future storms." They were in the room now, spreading out, cutting off any possible escape route. The presence behind them was growing stronger, more solid. Jeremiah could see it now in his peripheral vision, a shape that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3. "Every town has its secrets," Ruth Ann continued, her voice almost sympathetic. "Some towns have serial killers. Some have corrupt politicians. We have a hungry storm, and we've learned to live with it, to make it serve us, even as we serve it." The lights flickered back on suddenly, harsh and too bright, and in that moment of disorientation, they rushed him. Dozens of hands grabbing, pulling, lifting. Jeremiah fought back, swinging the chair, connecting with bodies that felt too solid, too cold. But there were too many of them, and that presence, that hungry thing that rode the storm, was wrapping around him like a living shroud. He was carried from the room, down the stairs, out into the storm. The rain hit him like ice, and the wind tried to tear him from their grasp, but they held on with inhuman strength. The procession moved through the streets, and now Jeremiah could see other townspeople joining them, all moving toward the square, all carrying lanterns that burned with a light that wasn't quite fire. The cage in the square was real, just as he'd seen from his window. It was ancient, made of iron that had been twisted into patterns that hurt to follow with his eyes. Inside was a space that seemed larger than the cage itself, a space that opened onto somewhere else, somewhere that storms were born. They forced him through a door in the cage that he hadn't seen until they opened it. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world changed. He was still in the cage, but he was also somewhere else. A vast plain of churning clouds and constant lightning, where the wind had substance and weight, where the rain fell upward as often as down. And there was something else here with him, the hungry thing that the town fed. It wasn't a creature in any sense he could understand. It was more like a living weather pattern, a consciousness made of pressure differentials and electrical charges. It had been sleeping before humans walked the earth, and it would be here long after they were gone. But it had learned to hunger, learned to want, learned to take. The townspeople were chanting now, their voices somehow carrying over the storm. The thing circled Jeremiah, examining him with senses that weren't sight or touch, but something older, more fundamental. He could feel it in his mind, rifling through his memories, his fears, his dreams. Then it spoke, not in words, but in understanding that appeared directly in his consciousness. It showed him the truth of temperance, the bargain struck over a century ago when the town founders realized what lived in the storms that plagued this land. They could have fled, could have abandoned this place, but instead they chose to stay and to serve. Every storm season they provided offerings. Travelers mostly, people who wouldn't be missed immediately, whose disappearances could be explained by the weather. In exchange, the thing in the storm protected the town, ensured their prosperity, kept the truly devastating tornadoes away from populated areas. It was, in its alien way, a fair trade. One life for hundreds, a few travelers over the decades for the safety of entire communities. The moral calculus was simple, even if the method was monstrous. But Jeremiah Talcott hadn't survived 15 years on the road by accepting his fate quietly. Even as the thing in the storm circled him, probing his mind with its alien consciousness, he was thinking, planning, looking for a way out. The cage might exist in two places at once, the town square and this strange storm dimension, but it was still a physical structure. It had bars, a floor, a door that had opened to let him in. The entity seemed amused by his resistance. Through their mental connection, he could feel its ancient patience, its certainty that he would eventually break. It had fed on hundreds, maybe thousands over the centuries. Each one had fought at first. Each one had eventually surrendered to the inevitable. But Jeremiah noticed something else in that connection. The entity wasn't just reading his mind. He could glimpse fragments of its thoughts, too. And in those fragments, he saw something that gave him hope. The cage wasn't just to keep offerings in. It was to keep the entity contained. The townspeople hadn't tamed this thing. They'd trapped it, made a prison that it could only leave through feeding, and only temporarily. The chanting outside was growing louder, more urgent. Through the bars, Jeremiah could see the townspeople arranged in precise patterns, their lanterns forming geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with purpose. Sheriff Caffrey stood at the cardinal north position, Ruth Ann to the south, Earl to the east, Curtis to the west. They were anchor points, he realized, keeping the cage stable between dimensions. The entity suddenly recoiled from his mind, sensing his understanding. For the first time, Jeremiah felt fear from it, not of him, but of the possibility he represented. If he could disrupt the ritual, if he could break one of those anchor points, the cage might destabilize. And if the cage destabilized while the entity was partially manifested in both dimensions. He didn't know what would happen, but he bet the entity did. And it didn't like the possibility. The thing rushed at him, no longer patient, no longer playing with its food. It hit him like a physical force, like being struck by compressed air. He flew backward, hitting the bars of the cage hard enough to see stars. But the impact also showed him something. The bars sparked where he touched them, a reaction between the metal, and something in the storm dimension. Jeremiah pulled himself up, gripping the bars tightly despite the electrical sensation that ran through his palms. The entity circled warily now, keeping its distance. It couldn't touch him while he was in contact with the bars. They were iron, he realized, old iron, probably forged with specific rituals, designed to conduct certain energies while repelling others. Outside, the chanting faltered for a moment. Sheriff Caffrey stepped forward, her face concerned. "Don't touch the bars, Mr. Talcott. You'll only hurt yourself." But Jeremiah had noticed something else. Each time he touched the bars, the lanterns flickered. The connection between the cage and the anchor points wasn't perfectly stable. It required concentration from the townspeople, and distractions weakened it. He began moving around the cage, running his hands along the bars, creating a constant stream of sparks. The entity writhed, pulled back to the farthest corner of their shared space. The chanting became discordant as the townspeople tried to compensate for the interference. "Stop him!" Ruth Ann shouted, but none of them dared approach the cage. They knew better than to get too close during a feeding. Jeremiah found what he was looking for, a weak point where two bars had been welded together, the joint imperfect after more than a century of use. He gripped it with both hands and pulled with all his strength. The metal groaned but held. He pulled harder, feeling the entity's panic bleeding into his mind. Then he remembered something from his truck. His cargo. Medical supplies including oxygen tanks. Pure oxygen was incredibly flammable, and in this strange dimension where physical laws seemed negotiable, fire might work differently. But his truck was back in the shed, guarded. Unless... He reached into his pocket and found his keys. On the keychain was a small LED flashlight, the kind truckers carried for emergency inspections. It wasn't much, but in a dimension made partially of electrical energy, even a small battery might have an effect. He turned it on and pressed it against the bars. The reaction was immediate and violent. The LED flared like a welding torch, the light spreading along the iron in patterns that reminded him of lightning. The entity shrieked, not a sound, but a pressure wave that made his ears pop and his nose bleed. The townspeople stumbled, their formation breaking. Earl fell to his knees, clutching his head. The eastern anchor point collapsed, and suddenly the cage was vibrating, phasing in and out of focus. Jeremiah could see both dimensions simultaneously, the town square and the storm realm occupying the same space. "Restabilize," Sheriff Caffrey commanded, but there was fear in her voice now. "Everyone back to positions." But Jeremiah pressed his advantage. He focused the LED on the weak joint, watching the metal heat up, begin to glow. The entity was thrashing now, no longer trying to feed, but trying to escape back to wherever it normally existed. But the ritual had been started. It couldn't leave until it was completed or catastrophically broken. The bar snapped. The sound was like a gunshot in both dimensions. The broken bar created a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but more importantly, it broke the cage's integrity. The carefully maintained boundary between dimensions began to collapse. Wind exploded through the gap. Not normal wind, but the substance of the storm dimension itself. It hit the townspeople like a physical wall, sending them sprawling. Lanterns went flying, their lights extinguishing the moment they left their bearers' hands. The entity made one last attempt to grab Jeremiah, to drag him with it as it was pulled back to its realm. But he held on to the broken bars, even as they cut into his palms, even as electricity coursed through his body. The thing's consciousness brushed his one final time, and in that moment he saw the truth. Temperance hadn't made a bargain with the storm entity. They'd captured it, imprisoned it, used it. The founders had been a cult, refugees from somewhere back east, practitioners of something that had gotten them driven out of more civilized places. They'd come here seeking isolation and found the entity already here, already feeding on travelers. But instead of avoiding it, they trapped it, turned it into a battery for their town's prosperity. Every person they fed to it didn't just die, they became part of it, their life force adding to the power the town could draw on. The crops that never failed, the buildings that never fell, the immunity to storm damage. It was all powered by the consumed souls of travelers. But now the mechanism was breaking. Without all 4 anchor points, without the cage intact, the boundary couldn't hold. The entity was being drawn back to its native dimension, and it was taking the stolen life force with it. The effect on the townspeople was immediate and horrible. Ruth Ann aged 20 years in 20 seconds, her face collapsing into wrinkles, her hair going from gray to white. Earl and Curtis simply crumpled, their bodies deflating like empty sacks. They'd been sustained by the entity's power for so long that without it, there was nothing left of them but dust and old clothes. Sheriff Caffrey tried to maintain control, shouting orders, trying to rally the remaining townspeople. But they were all suffering the same fate, rapid aging as decades of stolen time caught up with them at once. Some of them had been alive for over a century, Jeremiah realized, kept young by their proximity to the entity and their participation in the feedings. The cage was dissolving now, the iron bars turning to rust and crumbling away. The gap between dimensions was closing, but not smoothly. Reality was tearing, creating pockets of storm stuff in the normal world and pockets of normal space in the storm dimension. Lightning struck repeatedly, not from the sky, but from these dimensional tiers, each strike leaving behind glass sculptures of frozen air. Jeremiah dove through the gap in the bars just as they collapsed entirely. He hit the muddy ground of the town square hard, rolling to absorb the impact. The rain immediately soaked through his clothes, but it was real rain, cold and clean, not the strange substance that fell in the storm dimension. He looked back to see the last of the cage disappear, taking the entity with it. Where it had stood, there was now a perfect circle of glass, formed from superheated sand. The geometric patterns the townspeople had made with their lanterns were burned into the ground, creating a mandala of scorched earth that steamed in the rain. Sheriff Caffrey was on her knees, aging rapidly but more slowly than the others. She had been stronger, more deeply connected to the entity. She looked up at Jeremiah with eyes that were already clouding with cataracts. "You don't understand what you've done," she gasped, her voice cracking with age. "Without us to contain it, to feed it, it will roam free. The storms will come unchecked. Hundreds will die." "Maybe," Jeremiah said, backing away from her. "But they won't die as sacrifices. They'll die as natural disasters, not murdered by their own species." She laughed, a sound like grinding bones. "Natural? You think that thing is natural? It's older than nature, older than this world. We were the only thing standing between it and complete chaos." But even as she spoke, she was crumbling, her body unable to sustain itself without the borrowed life force. Within minutes, Sheriff Caffrey was nothing but a pile of old clothes and dust, quickly scattered by the wind. All around the square, the same scene played out. The entire population of Temperance, all 247 souls, returned to the ages they should have been. For most, that meant death. For a few, the youngest, it meant sudden aging from 20 to 40 or 50. They ran, screaming, disappearing into the storm. Jeremiah didn't wait to see what else might happen. He ran back toward the shed where his truck was parked, slipping and sliding in the mud, dodging lightning strikes that seemed to be targeting the remaining buildings. The town was coming apart, not just aging, but unmaking itself. Buildings collapsed not from damage, but from suddenly remembering they were over a century old and had been maintained by unnatural means. The shed was still standing, though its metal roof was peeling away in sheets. His truck was where he'd left it, apparently untouched. He climbed into the cab, hands shaking as he turned the key. The engine roared to life, beautiful and normal and real. He didn't bother with careful maneuvering. He drove straight through the closed doors, smashing them off their hinges. The truck lurched and bounced over debris, tires spinning in the mud, but he kept his foot on the accelerator. He had to get out before the town disappeared entirely, before whatever force had hidden it from maps reasserted itself. The road out of town was fragmenting, asphalt cracking and crumbling as decades of deferred entropy caught up all at once. He drove on the shoulder, on the grass, wherever there was solid ground. Behind him, he could hear buildings collapsing, the sound like dominoes falling in sequence. The town limits sign, "You are now leaving Temperance, come back soon," burst into flames as he passed it, the wood instantly aging to dry rot and igniting from the heat of its own accelerated decay. Then he was through, back on Highway 69, and Temperance was gone. Not destroyed, not ruined, but gone. When he looked in his mirrors, there was nothing but empty field where the town had been. No ruins, no debris, no evidence it had ever existed except for the circular burn marks that would probably fade by morning. The storm was breaking up too, the unnatural organization dissipating now that its anchor was gone. It was just a normal severe thunderstorm now, dangerous but not malevolent. Jeremiah drove through it, his hands locked on the wheel, checking his mirrors obsessively for any sign of pursuit. 20 miles down the road, he pulled into a real truck stop, one with bright lights and other vehicles and a Denny's that existed on maps. He parked between two other rigs and sat there shaking for 10 minutes before he could bring himself to go inside. The normalcy of the place was almost overwhelming. Truckers drinking coffee, complaining about routes and weather and dispatch, waitresses who looked tired but human, food that smelled like food. He ordered coffee with hands that wouldn't stop trembling and tried to process what had happened. His phone, which had been dead in Temperance, suddenly came alive with messages. Dozens of them from dispatch, from his ex-wife, from the hospital waiting for the medical supplies. According to the timestamps, he'd been missing for 3 days, though he was sure he'd only been in Temperance for a few hours. He called dispatch first, making up a story about being trapped by flooding, about losing cell signal. They were angry but relieved. The supplies were critical, and they'd been about to report the truck stolen. He promised to drive straight through to Kansas City, no more stops. But first he sat in that bright, normal Denny's and opened his laptop. He searched for Temperance, Oklahoma, and found nothing current. But in historical archives he found references. A town founded in 1889 by a group of settlers from Pennsylvania. A town that had mysteriously disappeared during a storm in 1894. All residents vanished. No trace ever found. Except that wasn't quite true. There were reports, scattered over the decades, of people claiming to have driven through a town called Temperance during storms. The reports were dismissed as confusion, hallucination, mistakes. But Jeremiah knew better now. The town had been appearing and disappearing for over a century, manifesting during severe weather to feed its patron entity. He found other things too. Reports of lower-than-expected tornado casualties along that stretch of Highway 69. Statistical anomalies where storms that should have been deadly petered out or changed course at the last moment. Temperance had been telling the truth about one thing. They had been protecting the area in their twisted way. But at what cost? How many travelers had been fed to that thing over the years? How many missing persons reports that were blamed on weather were actually victims of Temperance's hunger? Jeremiah closed his laptop and rubbed his eyes. He had deliveries to make, a job to keep, a life to pretend was normal. But he knew he'd never drive that stretch of highway again without remembering. Never see a storm approaching without wondering what might be riding inside it. He paid his check and went back to his truck. The medical supplies were still secure, still at the proper temperature. The refrigeration unit had run perfectly through everything. A miracle of normal engineering in a night of impossibilities. As he pulled back onto the highway, heading north toward Kansas City, he noticed something in his rearview mirror. Storm clouds were following him, maintaining a precise distance, never quite catching up but never falling behind. And in those clouds, when the lightning flashed just right, he could swear he saw a shape. The entity, free now, following the one who had released it. It didn't seem hostile. If anything, it seemed curious. For over a century, it had been trapped, forced to feed in controlled circumstances. Now it was free to roam, to explore, to perhaps remember what it had been before Temperance had caged it. Jeremiah drove faster, but the clouds maintained their distance. They followed him all the way to Kansas City, breaking apart only when he reached the city limits. But sometimes, on dark nights when storms rolled in, he could feel something watching him. Not hunting, just watching. He'd freed it from Temperance, and it remembered. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, only time would tell. The medical supplies were delivered on time, saving lives as intended. Jeremiah went back to his roots, his normal life, his regular problems. But he started keeping a journal, documenting strange occurrences, impossible towns, things that shouldn't exist but did. Because Temperance had taught him something important. The roads were full of secrets, and not all of them were content to stay hidden. Some of them were hungry, some of them were patient, and some of them were waiting for the next storm, the next traveler, the next feeding. He never found out what happened to the survivors of Temperance, those few who had been young enough to survive the rapid aging. They vanished into the storm and the night, carrying with them the knowledge of what they'd done, what they'd been part of. Maybe they found other towns, other cults, other entities to serve. Or maybe they just tried to forget, to pretend they'd never spent decades feeding travelers to a storm thing older than memory. But Jeremiah couldn't forget. Every time he saw storm clouds gathering, every time he heard about a trucker going missing in bad weather, he wondered. Had he done the right thing by destroying Temperance? Had he saved lives or doomed them? The entity was free now, uncontrolled, unbound. What would it do with its freedom? 3 months passed before Jeremiah Talcott started to understand the true consequences of what he'd done in Temperance. He'd gone back to his roots, pretending everything was normal, but the storms that season were different. They were stronger, less predictable, and they seemed to follow patterns that meteorologists couldn't explain. The Weather Service kept revising their models, baffled by systems that behaved according to no known atmospheric principles. But Jeremiah knew. He could feel it every time a storm system developed, that familiar presence, that ancient consciousness he'd encountered in the cage. The entity was free, and it was learning how to exist in a world that had changed dramatically since it had last roamed uncontrolled. It was testing boundaries, exploring its capabilities, and sometimes Jeremiah could swear it was looking for something, or someone. He was hauling a load of construction equipment from Tulsa to Wichita when he got the call that changed everything. It was from a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer it anyway. Maybe it was the timing, just as the first drops of rain hit his windshield, or maybe it was the feeling he'd had all day that something was about to happen. Mr. Talcott. The voice was young, female, scared. My name is Claire Morrison. I was from Temperance. Jeremiah nearly drove off the road. He corrected quickly, his heart pounding. You survived? Barely. I was 19 when you destroyed the town. The aging hit me hard, but not enough to kill me. I went from 19 to 43 in about 30 seconds. But I survived, and I've been looking for you ever since. Why? Jeremiah asked, though he was already pulling off at the next exit. Something in her voice told him this wasn't a revenge call. Because it's not over, the entity, we called it the hunger, it's not just free. It's growing, and there are others who want to recapture it, to rebuild what temperance was. They're gathering in a place called Remembrance, about 50 miles from where temperance used to be. Jeremiah parked in a gas station lot, rain now drumming steadily on his cab roof. Remembrance? I've never heard of it. You wouldn't have. It's not on any map, just like temperance wasn't. But it's older, deeper hidden. The survivors went there, the ones young enough to survive the aging, but they weren't the only ones there. Mr. Talcott, temperance wasn't unique. There are dozens of towns like it across the Midwest, all feeding different entities, all hidden from the normal world. The implications hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. If there were dozens of towns like Temperance, hundreds or thousands of people complicit in feeding travelers to otherworldly entities, then the scope of this horror was beyond anything he'd imagined. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because they blame you for releasing the hunger. They say you've upset a balance that took centuries to perfect, and they're planning something, a ritual to recapture not just the hunger but all the freed entities. A grand feeding that will require—" She paused, and he could hear her struggling with the words. "They need someone who's been touched by an entity but survived, someone who can act as a conduit between dimensions, someone like you." Jeremiah's scars began to ache, the ones on his palms from gripping the iron bars of the cage. They'd never fully healed, remaining sensitive to weather changes, especially storms. Now they burned like fresh wounds. "Where are you now?" he asked. "Oklahoma City. There's a diner off I-40, the Midnight Sun. I can meet you there in 2 hours." Jeremiah looked at his load, calculated delivery times, weighed responsibilities against threats. The construction equipment could wait. This couldn't. "I'll be there," he said. The drive to Oklahoma City was tense, the storm following him the entire way. Not just following. Hurting, he realized. The rain would lighten when he slowed down, intensify when he tried to speed up. The entity was guiding him, but toward what? Toward Claire and answers, or toward a trap? The Midnight Sun Diner was one of those 24-hour places that catered to truckers and insomniacs, bright and garish against the stormy night. Jeremiah parked and went inside, scanning the booths until he saw her. Claire Morrison looked exactly as she'd described, a 19-year-old aged instantly to 43. Her face had the peculiar quality of youth stretched over older bones, smooth in some places but deeply lined in others, as if the aging had been uneven, imperfect. She was nursing a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly. When she saw him, her eyes widened with a mixture of relief and fear. "You came," she said, as he slid into the booth across from her. "Tell me everything," Jeremiah said. Claire took a deep breath and began. Temperance was part of a network. Back in the 1800s, there was an organization. They called themselves the Covenant of Storms. They were occultists, people who'd studied the spaces between spaces, the things that existed in parallel to our world. They came west looking for places where the boundary was thin, where entities like the hunger naturally manifested. She pulled out an old journal, its leather binding cracked with age. "This belonged to my great-great-grandmother. She was one of the original founders of Temperance. According to this, they didn't come to trap just one entity. They came to trap 7. 7? Claire nodded. 7 entities, 7 towns, forming a pattern across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. Each town bound to its entity, each entity contained and controlled through regular feedings. Together, they formed a kind of network that stabilized weather patterns across the Great Plains. Without them, the storms would be worse," Jeremiah finished, remembering what Sheriff Caffrey had said. Not just worse, catastrophic. The entities don't create storms, but they're drawn to them, feed on them, amplify them. Controlled, they could be directed, used to minimize damage. Uncontrolled. She gestured to the window where the rain was now falling horizontally, driven by winds that shouldn't exist in this area. So I didn't save anyone, Jeremiah said bitterly. I just traded controlled evil for chaotic evil. Maybe. Or maybe you gave us a chance to find a better way. Claire leaned forward. The Covenant's method was monstrous, but their understanding of these entities was real. There might be other ways to contain them, ways that don't involve human sacrifice. And remembrance? The gathering you mentioned? Claire's expression darkened. The surviving members of the Covenant are regrouping. They've lost temperance, but the other 6 towns are still active, still feeding their entities. They want to perform something called the Grand Convergence, a ritual that would merge all 7 entities into one super entity that they could control absolutely. That sounds insane. It is. The journal mentions that it was attempted once before, in 1923. The result was the tri-state tornado, the deadliest in U.S. history, and that was with only 3 entities. With 7, she shook her head. It would be apocalyptic. Jeremiah was about to respond when the lights in the diner flickered. Not a power surge, something else. The other patrons didn't seem to notice, continuing their conversations and meals, but Claire went rigid with fear. They found us, she whispered. Through the window, Jeremiah could see figures approaching through the rain. They moved wrong, too smoothly, as if the wind and water didn't affect them. As they got closer, he recognized the gait, the purposeful, synchronized movement. These were Covenant members, people sustained by entity energy just as the citizens of Temperance had been. "Back door," Jeremiah said, grabbing Claire's arm. They rushed through the kitchen, ignoring the protests of the cook, and burst out into the alley behind the diner. The rain hit them like a wall, but Jeremiah pulled Claire toward his truck. They'd almost reached it when figures emerged from behind the vehicle. More Covenant members moving to surround them. "Jeremiah Talcott," one of them said, his voice carrying despite the storm. He was tall, gaunt, wearing clothes that belonged to another era. "You've caused us considerable trouble." "Get in line," Jeremiah said, pushing Claire behind him. The man smiled, an expression devoid of warmth. "I am Matthias Blackwood, speaker for the Covenant of Storms. You destroyed one of our anchors, released one of our charges. The balance we've maintained for over a century is breaking because of your ignorance." "Your balance was built on murder," Jeremiah said. "Our balance saved thousands of lives," Matthias countered. "Every person fed to the entities prevented dozens of storm deaths. We are gardeners, Mr. Talcott, pruning a few branches to save the tree." "Pretty speech," Claire said from behind Jeremiah. "But you're not gardeners. You're parasites, feeding off the same entities you claim to control." Matthias's expression hardened. "And you, Claire Morrison, are a traitor to your heritage. Your family has served the Covenant for 5 generations. Your rebellion dishonors them all." "My family were murderers," Claire said. "I choose to break that chain." The Covenant members were closing in, tightening their circle. Jeremiah counted at least 8 of them, all moving with that unnatural synchronization. But then he felt it, a familiar presence in the storm above. The hunger was here, drawn by the concentration of Covenant members, by their residual connection to entity energy. "Your old friend is hungry," Jeremiah said to Matthias. "Can you feel it up there? It remembers being caged. It remembers being fed. And it remembers who held its leash." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Matthias's face. He looked up at the storm clouds, which were beginning to rotate directly overhead. Impossible. Without the cage, without the anchors, it can't manifest physically. Want to bet? Jeremiah raised his scarred hands, and the marks on his palms flared with heat. The entity recognized him, the one who'd freed it, and responded. Lightning struck the alley, not randomly but with purpose, forming a barrier between Jeremiah and the Covenant members. The concrete where it hit turned to glass, creating a wall of fulgurite. The Covenant members stumbled back, their synchronized movement breaking. "Run!" Jeremiah shouted to Claire. They sprinted for the truck as more lightning struck, creating a maze of glass walls that separated and confused their pursuers. Jeremiah yanked open the driver's door, practically threw Claire inside, and climbed in after her. The engine started on the first try, and he slammed it into gear. But as they pulled out of the alley, Claire grabbed his arm. "Wait! We can't just run. If they complete the Grand Convergence, nowhere will be safe." "Then what do you suggest?" "We stop them. We find the other 6 towns, warn the entities what the Covenant is planning. If the entities know they're going to be merged, enslaved completely, they might resist." It was insane. Actively seeking out more entity-controlled towns, deliberately putting themselves in danger. But Jeremiah knew she was right. Running would only delay the inevitable. "Do you know where the other towns are?" he asked. Claire pulled out the journal again, flipping to a hand-drawn map. "Not precisely, but I know the general areas. They're arranged in a specific pattern. A heptagram, a 7-pointed star. Temperance was the eastern point. The others are penance in Nebraska, abstinence in northern Kansas, reverence in southern Kansas, penitence in western Oklahoma, silence in the Texas Panhandle, and providence in central Oklahoma. All virtue names," Jeremiah noted. The Covenant wasn't subtle. They didn't need to be. Who would believe it? Claire traced the pattern on the map. "If we can disrupt even one more town, break another point of the star, the Grand Convergence becomes impossible." Jeremiah thought about it as he drove, the storm still following overhead. 7 towns, 6 still active. Hundreds of people complicit in systematic murder. Entities that might be hostile, might be hungry, might be insane from centuries of imprisonment. "We'll need help," he said finally. "I know some people," Claire said. "Descendants of Covenant members who, like me, rejected their heritage. They call themselves the Liberation. They've been working to document the towns, to find ways to free the entities safely." "Safely? There's no safe way to do this." "Safer, then. Ways that don't result in the complete destruction we saw with Temperance." They drove through the night, the storm keeping pace, discussing plans and possibilities. Claire made calls on a satellite phone, speaking in coded language to contacts across 3 states. By dawn, they had a meeting place, an abandoned rest stop on Route 166, halfway between Penitence and Reverence. The rest stop had been closed for years, its buildings graffitied and partially collapsed. But when they arrived, there were already 4 vehicles there. 2 pickups, an SUV, and surprisingly, another 18-wheeler. The people who emerged were an eclectic mix. An elderly Native American man who introduced himself as Joseph Crow Feather, saying his people had fought the Covenant for generations. A young couple, historians from the University of Kansas who'd stumbled onto the truth while researching disappearances. A former sheriff from Nebraska who'd lost his son to penance 20 years ago. And the other trucker, a woman named Diane Holbrook, who'd had her own encounter with one of the towns. "So," Joseph said once they'd gathered in the ruins of the rest stop's main building, "Claire tells us you're the one who broke Temperance." "I am," Jeremiah confirmed. Joseph studied him with eyes that seemed to see more than just the physical. "The spirits are restless because of what you did. But sometimes restlessness is necessary for change. The question is, Diane said, how do we stop the Covenant without unleashing 6 more uncontrolled entities? Claire spread the journal on a broken picnic table. According to my great-great-grandmother's writings, the entities aren't naturally hostile to humans. They're curious about us, drawn to our emotional energy, especially the intense emotions generated by storms. Fear, awe, desperation. The Covenant trapped them and forced them to feed on death, but that wasn't their original nature. You're saying we could communicate with them? The historian, who'd introduced himself as Marcus Fielding, asked. Jeremiah did, Claire pointed out. When he was in the cage with the hunger, there was a mental connection. Brief, but real. All eyes turned to Jeremiah. He thought about those moments in the cage, the alien presence in his mind, the overwhelming hunger, but also something else. Loneliness, confusion, rage at being imprisoned. It wasn't communication exactly, he said slowly. More like emotional resonance. I could feel what it felt, and for a moment I think it could feel what I felt. That might be enough, Joseph said. In my people's traditions, we speak of spirit walking, of meeting entities from other realms and spaces between. If we could create such a space, a neutral ground, the Covenant would never allow it. The former sheriff, Bill Hutchinson, said grimly. They've got too much invested in the current system. Then we don't ask permission, Diane said. We take action, force their hand. They spent hours planning, pooling their knowledge. Joseph knew rituals that could create temporary dimensional spaces. Marcus and his wife Sarah had mapped storm patterns that might indicate entity activity. Bill had law enforcement contacts who could provide cover stories. Diane had connections in the trucking community who could help with transportation and logistics. But it was Claire who proposed the most dangerous part of the plan. We need someone to enter one of the active towns, make contact with its entity while it's still caged. Someone who has already been touched by entity energy, who might survive the connection. Everyone looked at Jeremiah again. I had a feeling you were going to say that, he said. It doesn't have to be you, Claire said quickly. I was aged by entity energy. I could... No, Jeremiah interrupted. I broke temperance. If there's a price to pay for that, I should be the one to pay it. They decided on reverence as their target. It was the closest, and according to Sarah's research, it had the lowest population of the remaining towns, only 89 people. It was also the newest, established in 1931 after some kind of schism in the Covenant. Newer means potentially weaker bindings, Joseph explained. The rituals might not be as deeply rooted. They would approach during the next major storm system, which meteorologists were predicting for 3 days hence. It would provide cover and activate the entity, making contact more likely. Joseph would create a buffer zone, a dimensional pocket where Jeremiah could meet the entity without being immediately consumed. The others would create distractions, draw the Covenant's attention. And if it goes wrong? Bill asked. Then we fall back to Claire's original plan, Diane said. We break the towns one by one, release the entities, and hope the chaos is less destructive than what the Covenant is planning. They dispersed to gather supplies and prepare. Jeremiah and Claire drove to a motel 50 miles away, far enough to avoid Covenant detection but close enough to reach reverence when the time came. You don't have to do this, Claire said as they checked in. You've already done more than anyone could expect. I started this, Jeremiah replied. I should see it through. That night he dreamed of storms. Not ordinary storms, but living things, conscious and curious, exploring a world they'd been kept from for over a century. In the dream, the hunger spoke to him, not in words but in images and sensations. It showed him its home dimension, a place of constant change and raw emotion, where thought and weather were the same thing. It showed him how the Covenant had trapped it, using rituals that were part science, part magic, all abomination. Iron cages inscribed with binding symbols, anchored by human sacrifice, powered by stolen life force. The entities hadn't wanted to kill, but the cages had twisted them, made them hungry for the only food they were given: human death. And it showed him something else, something that made him wake gasping. The grand convergence wouldn't just merge the entities, it would open a permanent gateway between dimensions, allowing the Covenant to draw unlimited power from the entity realm. They would become gods of weather, able to create or destroy storms at will, holding the entire world hostage to their whims. "We have to stop them," he said to Claire, who'd woken at his distress. "We will," she promised, "whatever it takes." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Joseph taught Jeremiah meditation techniques to protect his mind during entity contact. Marcus and Sarah refined their maps, identifying the exact location of Reverence, hidden in plain sight off Highway 183, appearing only during storms. Bill coordinated with sympathetic contacts, ensuring local law enforcement would be mysteriously busy elsewhere when they made their move. Diane organized backup transportation in case they needed to evacuate quickly. On the third night, the storm system arrived as predicted. It was massive, stretching from Texas to Nebraska, spawning tornadoes and flooding across multiple states. The Weather Service was calling it unprecedented, a once-in-a-generation event. But Jeremiah knew better. This was the Covenant's doing, preparation for their grand convergence. They met at a crossroads 5 miles from where Reverence should appear. The storm was already raging, rain coming down in sheets, wind bending trees nearly horizontal. Lightning struck with increasing frequency, and in the distance they could hear the freight train roar of an approaching tornado. "Everyone ready?" Jeremiah asked, though he had to shout to be heard over the storm. They nodded, faces grim but determined. Joseph had painted symbols on Jeremiah's hands and forehead, using a mixture of ash and oils that smelled of sage and something older. Claire handed him a piece of iron. "A railroad spike," she said, from the same line that had provided his weapon in Temperance. "For protection," she said, "and as a key, if you need to break anything." They drove toward Reverence in convoy, Jeremiah leading in his truck. As they approached the coordinates Marcus had identified, the air began to change. It became thicker, harder to breathe, charged with electricity that made their hair stand on end. Then, through the rain, they saw it. Reverence materialized like a mirage becoming solid. A small town that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, but did. It was more modest than Temperance had been. Just a main street with a dozen buildings, but Jeremiah could feel the power radiating from it. This entity was different from the Hunger, older, more patient, more dangerous. The convoy stopped at the town limits. This was as far as the others could go without alerting the Covenant. From here, Jeremiah would go alone. He drove into Reverence slowly, expecting resistance, but the streets were empty. No welcoming committee, no sheriff, no concerned citizens, just dark buildings and rain and the feeling of being watched by something vast and invisible. He parked in front of what looked like a church, though the symbol above the door wasn't any cross he recognized. It was a 7-pointed star with an eye in the center, the Covenant's true emblem. The church doors were open, candlelight flickering within. Jeremiah took a deep breath, gripped the railroad spike, and walked inside. The interior was wrong. The space was too large for the building that contained it, stretching back into shadows that shouldn't exist. Pews faced not an altar but a cage, similar to the one in Temperance but more elaborate, more carefully crafted. And inside the cage was not emptiness but a visible distortion, a place where space folded in on itself. Standing beside the cage was a figure Jeremiah recognized, Matthias Blackwood, the speaker for the Covenant he'd encountered in Oklahoma City. "We knew you'd come," Matthias said calmly. "The entities call to those they've touched. You couldn't resist any more than a moth can resist flame." "I'm here to stop you," Jeremiah said. Matthias laughed. "Stop us? You're here to complete us. You see, Mr. Talcott, the Grand Convergence requires a conduit, someone who survived direct contact with an entity. You're not here to stop us. You're here to become the bridge between worlds." The cage began to pulse with light, and Jeremiah felt the entity within reaching for him, not hostile but desperate, trying to communicate something urgent. He stepped closer, ignoring Matthias's triumphant smile, and pressed his scarred palm against the bars. The contact was immediate and overwhelming. The entity, it called itself the Witness, flooded into his mind. But this time, Jeremiah was prepared. Joseph's meditations held, creating a buffer that kept him from being consumed. And in that protected space, the Witness showed him the truth. The truth the Witness showed Jeremiah was more horrible than anything he'd imagined. The Grand Convergence wasn't just about merging 7 entities. It was about creating a god. The Covenant had spent over a century feeding the entities not just human lives, but human souls, each death adding to a reservoir of spiritual energy that would, when released all at once, transform whoever controlled it into something beyond human, beyond mortal, beyond any natural law. And Matthias Blackwood intended to be that god. Through the Witness's memories, Jeremiah saw the real history of the Covenant. They weren't preserving some ancient tradition or maintaining a necessary evil. They were a cult of would-be deities who had discovered that entity energy could be accumulated, stored, and eventually absorbed by a human host. But it required massive amounts of death, centuries of feeding, and a perfect ritual performed at the exact moment when all 7 entities were aligned. That moment was tonight. "You're beginning to understand," Matthias said, watching Jeremiah's face. "The beauty of it is that you don't have a choice. The entity has already marked you. Your scarred hands are conductors. When we begin the ritual, you'll draw all 7 entities here, whether you want to or not." Jeremiah tried to pull his hand away from the cage, but it was stuck. The scars on his palm fused to the iron bars. The Witness was still pouring information into his mind, showing him the locations of the other towns, the positions of other Covenant members, the complex mathematics of the convergence ritual. It was trying to help him, he realized, trying to give him the knowledge he'd need to stop this, but it was also showing him something else. The other entities were already being moved. The Covenant had teams at each town, preparing to transport the cages here to Reverence. Within hours, all 7 entities would be in one place for the first time since their capture. "Why tell me this?" Jeremiah asked Matthias, still struggling to free his hand. "Why reveal your plan?" "Because I want you to understand the magnitude of what you're part of," Matthias replied. "You destroyed temperance out of misguided morality, thinking you were saving lives. But you were just playing your part in a larger design. The hunger had to be freed first, you see. It's the youngest and strongest of the 7. Free, it would draw the others, make them restless, make them easier to control when reunited." Jeremiah felt sick. He'd been manipulated from the beginning. His destruction of temperance hadn't been a victory. It had been part of Matthias's plan. "You're lying," he said. But even as he said it, he could feel through the Witness that it was true. The hunger's freedom had indeed affected the other entities, made them more active, more desperate to escape. The beautiful irony, Matthias continued, moving closer to the cage, "is that your friends outside think they're here to stop us. But they're actually going to help complete the ritual. Each of them has been touched by entity energy in some way. Claire through her aging, Joseph through his spirit walking, the others through their proximity to the towns. They're all conductors, just like you. When the convergence begins, they'll amplify the effect." The church doors burst open, and Claire rushed in, followed by Joseph and Bill. They'd clearly fought their way past some resistance. Claire had a bloody lip, and Bill was limping. "Jeremiah!" Claire shouted. "It's a trap. The whole town is surrounded by Covenant members. They were waiting for us." "I know," Jeremiah said, still unable to free his hand from the cage. Matthias just explained everything. Joseph stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the cage and the entity within. "A witness," he said softly. "I've heard stories of such beings. They observe, record, remember. They're living libraries of everything they've seen. And soon," Matthias said, "all that knowledge will be mine." More Covenant members entered the church, dozens of them filling the pews. They began to chant in a language that predated any modern tongue, their voices harmonizing in ways that human throats shouldn't be able to produce. The air grew thick, and outside, the storm intensified. Through the windows, Jeremiah could see vehicles arriving, trucks and vans, each carrying a cage. The other entities were being brought here just as Matthias had said. The Hunger arrived first, its cage carried by a team of Covenant members who moved with mechanical precision. Even trapped, Jeremiah could feel its rage, its recognition of him. One by one, the other cages were brought in and arranged in a specific pattern around the church, forming the 7-pointed star Claire had described. Each entity was different. One was visible as a constant shift of shadows, another as a geometric pattern that hurt to look at, a third as what looked like living lightning contained in iron. "Jeremiah," Claire said urgently, "we need to get you free." She grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away from the witness's cage. But the moment she touched him, she screamed. The entity energy in her, the aging force that had transformed her, reacted violently to the concentrated power. Her hair went white, then returned to its normal color, flickering back and forth between youth and age. "Don't touch him," Joseph warned. "He's become a focal point. The entities are using him as an anchor." But Joseph was wrong, Jeremiah realized. The entities weren't using him, they were trying to communicate through him. Each of them was pouring their memories, their knowledge, their desperate desire for freedom into his mind. The overload was excruciating, but buried in the chaos was something useful: the structure of the ritual itself. The grand convergence required precise timing, specific words, and most importantly, the willing participation of the entities. That was why they'd been fed for so long. Not just to store energy, but to break their wills, to make them compliant. But the Hunger, having tasted freedom, was no longer compliant, and it was spreading that defiance to the others. "Matthias," Jeremiah said through gritted teeth, "you've made a mistake. The Hunger isn't broken anymore. 3 months of freedom has let it remember what it was before you caged it." Matthias's confident smile faltered slightly. "It doesn't matter. The ritual will force compliance." "Will it? When was the last time you fed it? When was the last time any of them were fed properly?" Jeremiah could feel the answer through the entities. Weeks for some, months for others. The Covenant had been so focused on the convergence that they'd neglected the regular feedings. The entities weren't just hungry, they were starving, and starving entities were unpredictable. The chanting reached a crescendo, and Matthias began the ritual proper. He spoke words that seemed to tear at reality itself, each syllable causing the air to ripple. The cages began to glow, and the entities within became more active, more visible. But something was wrong. The entities weren't moving in harmony as they should. The hunger was pulling one direction, the witness another. The shadow entity was trying to escape entirely while the lightning entity was earthing itself, sending bolts of electricity through the church floor. "Control them," Matthias shouted to his followers. "Increase the binding." The Covenant members chanted louder, but several of them were already showing strain. Without the regular feeding of life force, they were aging rapidly, their borrowed time running out. One elderly man simply crumbled to dust mid-chant, his voice cutting off abruptly. That's when Diane and Marcus burst into the church, but they weren't alone. Behind them came a stream of people, truckers, Diane's contacts from the road. Dozens of them, all carrying iron bars, crowbars, tire irons, anything made of iron they could find. "Heard you might need some help," Diane shouted over the chaos. Turns out, truckers don't like hearing about fellow drivers being fed to monsters. The truckers didn't wait for orders. They attacked the Covenant members, iron weapons disrupting the careful formation needed for the ritual. The chanting became discordant, and the entity's cages began to destabilize. Joseph pulled something from his coat, a bundle of sage and other herbs, bound with red thread. He lit it, and the smoke that rose wasn't normal smoke. It was thick, almost solid, and it moved with purpose, surrounding Jeremiah and the witness's cage. "This will break the connection," Joseph said, beginning his own chant in what sounded like Cheyenne. "But you must want to be free. You must reject the binding." Jeremiah focused on that desire, on his need to be free from the cage, from the entity, from this entire nightmare. He thought of his truck, his roots, his simple life that now seemed so far away. The scars on his palms burned like fire, and for a moment he thought his hands might actually be combusting. Then, with a sound like tearing metal, he fell backward, his hand finally free. The palm was raw, bleeding, with the pattern of the cage bars branded into his skin. But he was free. The moment he separated from the cage, the witness let out a sound. Not quite a scream, more like a sigh of relief. It had given him everything it could, and now it wanted only one thing: freedom. "The keys!" Claire shouted. "Matthias must have keys to the cages." Jeremiah looked at the Covenant leader, who was backing toward the altar, his face a mask of rage and fear. The ritual was collapsing, the carefully maintained order dissolving into chaos. Several cages were already showing cracks, the entities within pounding against their prisons with renewed vigor. "You don't understand," Matthias said. "Without the Covenant, without the feedings, these things will devour everything. The storms they'll create will level cities." "Maybe," Jeremiah said, advancing on him. "Or maybe they'll just go home, back to whatever dimension they came from. Either way, it's better than letting you become a god." Matthias pulled out a gun, an old revolver that looked like it had been modified with the same symbols that decorated the cages. "Stay back. This weapon was designed to kill those marked by entities. One shot, and your connection to them will turn you inside out." But before he could fire, the hunger's cage finally shattered. 3 months of freedom had taught it new tricks, and weeks without feeding had made it desperate. It erupted from its prison like a liquid shadow, flowing across the church floor toward Matthias. The Covenant leader fired at it, the bullets passing harmlessly through its non-physical form. Then it reached him, and for a moment, the two seemed to merge. Matthias trying to absorb its power as planned, the entity trying to feed on him. But Matthias hadn't counted on one thing. The hunger remembered him, remembered every person he'd fed to it over the decades, every death he'd ordered, every soul he'd condemned, and it was angry. The scream Matthias let out wasn't human. It was the sound of someone experiencing every death they'd ever caused, all at once. His body began to change, flesh running like wax, reforming into something that was neither human nor entity, but a horrible hybrid of both. He reached out toward his followers, pleading for help, but they were backing away in terror. Then the other cages began to break. The witness flowed out like living information, words and images cascading through the air. The shadow entity exploded outward, turning the church dark as midnight. The lightning entity earthed itself properly, sending electricity coursing through every metal surface. "Everyone out!" Jeremiah shouted. "Now!" The truckers didn't need to be told twice. They ran for the exits, dragging unconscious Covenant members with them. Even enemies didn't deserve to die like this. Claire grabbed Joseph, who was swaying from the effort of his ritual. Bill helped Diane, who'd been struck by a piece of flying cage. But Jeremiah hesitated at the door, looking back. The entities were free, all 7 of them, swirling around the church in a chaos of otherworldly power. But they weren't attacking anyone except Matthias and the few Covenant members who tried to maintain the ritual. They were leaving. He could feel it through his connection to them. They were going home. The dimensional barriers weakened by the failed ritual were allowing them to return to wherever they'd come from. One by one, they began to fade, becoming translucent, then invisible. All except the hunger. It remained, still feeding on Matthias, who had become something indescribable. A constantly shifting mass of flesh and shadow and regret. But as Jeremiah watched, the hunger turned toward him, and for a moment their minds touched again. "Thank you," it conveyed. Not in words, but in pure emotion. Free. Then it too began to fade, taking what remained of Matthias with it. The Covenant leader's final scream echoed between dimensions before cutting off abruptly. Where he had stood, there was only a dark stain on the church floor, shaped like a 7-pointed star. The church began to collapse. Without entity energy sustaining it, the impossible architecture couldn't hold. Jeremiah ran, diving through the door just as the roof caved in. He landed hard on the wet ground, rain immediately soaking through his clothes. Around him, reverence was disappearing. Buildings aged decades in seconds. Wood rotting, metal rusting, glass shattering. The Covenant members who'd survived were aging too, those who'd lived beyond their natural spans crumbling to dust, others simply becoming their true ages. Within minutes, there was nothing left of reverence but ruins and the 7 empty cages, their iron bars twisted and broken but still emanating a faint sense of wrongness. The storm was breaking up too. Without the entities to sustain it, it was reverting to a normal weather pattern. The rain lessened to a drizzle, then stopped entirely. Stars began to appear through gaps in the clouds. "Is it over?" Claire asked, helping Jeremiah to his feet. "This is," he said, looking at the devastation around them. "But there are still 5 towns out there. 5 more entities. 5 more groups of Covenant members." "Actually," Marcus said, consulting his phone, "I'm getting reports from our contacts. All 6 remaining towns are experiencing similar collapses. It seems the failed ritual created a resonance. When the entities here broke free, it triggered a chain reaction." Joseph nodded slowly. The 7-pointed star was meant to bind them together. When it broke, they all felt it. "They're all going home." Diane laughed, a sound of relief and exhaustion. "So we won? It's actually over?" "The Covenant of Storms is finished," Joseph said. "But the storms themselves will continue. Without the entities to control them, weather patterns will be chaotic for years, maybe decades. Better chaotic than controlled by would-be gods," Bill said grimly. They stood there in the ruins of reverence. A motley group of truckers, historians, mystics, and survivors, watching the last traces of the town blow away in the wind. The other truckers were already heading back to their rigs, ready to return to their roots, their normal lives. Most of them would probably convince themselves this had all been a hallucination, a shared delusion brought on by the storm. But Jeremiah knew better. His scarred hands would never let him forget. Neither would Claire, whose aging had finally stabilized. She looked about 30 now, split difference between her true age and what the entity energy had done to her. "What will you do now?" she asked him as they walked back to his truck. "Keep driving," he said. "Keep watching. The Covenant might be gone, but they weren't the only ones who knew about entities. There might be others, other groups with different methods, different goals." "The Liberation will keep monitoring," Claire said. "We'll build a proper network, share information, make sure nothing like this happens again. And if it does," she smiled grimly, "then we'll stop it. We know it can be done now. The entities can be fought. The cults can be defeated. It won't be easy, but it's possible." Jeremiah climbed into his truck, the familiar seat and controls a comfort after the chaos. The refrigeration unit was still running, his cargo of construction equipment still secure. To anyone checking the logs, he'd simply been delayed by weather. Just another trucker waiting out a storm. But as he pulled onto the highway, heading north toward his original destination, he could feel the difference in the air. The entities were gone, but their absence left a void. Nature was rushing to fill it, and the result would be unpredictable. More storms, certainly. Stronger ones, probably. But natural storms, following natural patterns, without the hungry consciousness behind them. His phone rang. Dispatch, furious about the delay, demanding explanations. He gave them the weather excuse, promised to make up time, all the while thinking about what he'd learned. The highway system wasn't just roads connecting cities. It was a network of ley lines, paths of power that entities could travel, that cults could exploit, that truckers navigated every day without knowing the danger. He'd stumbled into this world by accident, but now he was part of it. 3 weeks later, he got a package at his apartment in Wichita. No return address, but he recognized Claire's handwriting. Inside was a new GPS unit, modified with the Liberation software. It showed not just roads and exits, but danger zones, historical incident sites, and current threat levels. A note was attached. For the road ahead, stay safe, stay alert, and remember you're not alone out there. The Liberation is watching too. See. He installed it in his truck the next day. His first run with it was enlightening. So many marked locations. So many places where reality had worn thin. But also safe zones. Truck stops and diners that the Liberation had verified as normal. Truly safe places to rest. The storms that season were indeed worse than usual. Meteorologists blamed climate change, El Niño, solar activity. Anything but the truth. Tornadoes touched down in unexpected places, following no predictable pattern. But the death tolls were surprisingly low. Without the entities directing them toward populated areas, the storms spent their fury on empty fields and abandoned places. Jeremiah drove through it all, watching for signs of new threats, new cults, new attempts to harness powers that shouldn't be touched. Sometimes he found them. A group in Missouri trying to summon something during a thunderstorm. A family in Arkansas that had been feeding roadkill to something living in their storm cellar. Each time he called the Liberation, and they dealt with it quietly, efficiently. But mostly, he just drove. Mile after mile of American highway, truck stops and way stations, loading docks and delivery points. The same job he'd always done, but with new awareness of what lurked just beyond the headlights' reach. Sometimes, during particularly fierce storms, He thought he could feel the hunger out there somewhere, free in its home dimension but still aware of him. It never tried to make contact, but there was a sense of gratitude, maybe, or recognition. Two beings who'd briefly shared something profound and terrible, now going their separate ways. The scars on his palms never fully healed. They would ache before storms, burn when entity energy was near, tingle when something unnatural was happening. They were his early warning system, his reminder, his burden. Other truckers who noticed them assumed they were from some industrial accident. He let them believe that. It was easier than the truth. A year after the fall of reverence, he met Claire at a truck stop in Missouri. She looked younger. The liberation had found ways to partially reverse entity aging, though she'd never be 19 again. She showed him statistics, maps, reports. Entity sightings were down 90%. Cult activity was nearly non-existent. The highways were safer than they'd been in over a century. "We did good," she said, raising her coffee cup in a toast. "We survived," Jeremiah corrected, touching his cup to hers. "Sometimes that's enough." They talked through the night about their new normal. Claire was going to college, studying meteorology and folklore, trying to understand the intersection of science and the supernatural. Joseph Crow Feather had become the Liberation's spiritual advisor, teaching others the protection rituals that had saved them. Bill Hutchinson had started a support group for families who'd lost loved ones to the entity towns. There were more than anyone had realized. "And Diane?" Jeremiah asked. "Still driving," Claire said with a smile. "Like you. She says the road is in her blood now, but she also says she'll never look at a storm the same way." Neither would he. Every dark cloud held potential threat. Every unusual weather pattern demanded investigation. But that was his life now, a trucker who also happened to be a guardian against things most people couldn't imagine. As dawn broke over the truck stop, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Claire stood to leave. "Stay in touch," she said. "The Liberation needs people like you, people who've seen the worst and kept driving anyway." "I will," he promised. She walked to her car, a sensible sedan, nothing that would draw attention, and drove away. Jeremiah sat there a while longer, watching the sunrise, feeling the weight of everything he now knew. Then he climbed back into his truck, checked his modified GPS for any alerts, and pulled back onto the highway. He had a load of medical supplies to deliver in Denver, a deadline to meet, a job to do. The road stretched out before him, endless and full of hidden dangers, but also full of other truckers, other guardians, others who watched and protected without recognition or thanks. The covenant of storms was gone, the entities were free, and the world kept turning. Sometimes, late at night on empty highways, he'd think about Matthias Blackwood's final moments, experiencing every death he'd caused. It was justice of a sort, though Jeremiah took no satisfaction in it. The man had believed he was saving the world while preparing to rule it. How many others were out there with similar delusions, similar plans? But that was a worry for another day. Right now, he had miles to cover, a delivery to make, a life to live. The storm season would come again, as it always did. But this time it would be natural storms against human preparation, not supernatural hunger against human sacrifice. His CB radio crackled to life. Another trucker warning about a speed trap ahead. Jeremiah smiled and picked up the handset to thank them. This was his world, his community, his purpose. He was a trucker who'd stumbled into cosmic horror and survived, who'd freed entities older than civilization and lived to tell about it, who'd helped destroy a century-old cult and prevented an apocalypse. But mostly, he was just a trucker, driving through the American heartland, watching for storms and keeping the supply chain moving. It wasn't heroic, usually wasn't even interesting. But it was honest work, and after everything he'd seen, honest work felt like a blessing. The highway hummed beneath his wheels, the engine rumbled its familiar song, and Jeremiah Talcott drove on through the morning light, scarred hands steady on the wheel, eyes always watching the horizon for the next storm. Because storms always came. That was the nature of the world. The only question was whether humanity would face them as natural disasters or as something worse. Thanks to him, to Claire, to all the others who'd stood against the covenant, that question had been answered. For now. The modified GPS beeped softly, a low-level alert about unusual weather patterns in Nebraska. Not emergency level, just something to monitor. Jeremiah noted it mentally, already planning to route that way after his Denver delivery. Just to check. Just to be sure. Because that's what Guardians did. They watched, they waited, and when necessary, they acted. Not for glory or recognition, but because someone had to. And sometimes that someone was just a trucker with scarred hands and too much knowledge about what really moved through the storms. The road went on, and so did he.